What if one branch of humanity did not lose because it was weaker, but because it was too strong for a world that was changing? Across the frozen plains of Ice Age Eurasia, ancient humans built their survival on muscle, endurance, and brutal close-range power, and for thousands of years that strategy worked. But when the climate shifted and a different kind of human began to spread, strength alone was no longer enough. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, the wind comes first. It moves over a plain of frozen grass and broken stone, across patches of old snow that survive even under a pale sun, and into a shallow valley where the remains of a kill lie scattered in the cold. There are splintered bones here, cut marks hidden beneath frost, the drag of something heavy across the ground, and footprints already beginning to blur at the edges. Nothing in this landscape forgives weakness. The air strips heat from exposed skin in minutes. Winter lingers too long. Summer is never generous. Herds move vast distances and vanish. A successful hunt means life not only for the one who strikes, but for the small group waiting in shelter, hungry, watchful, burning precious fuel in the dark. In places like this, over thousands of years, one version of humanity becomes thick-boned, broad-chested, immensely strong, and almost unbelievably durable. These are not creatures choosing strength in the conscious way a civilization chooses a law or a king. Evolution does not plan. It keeps what works long enough to matter. And in this world, for a very long time, immense physical power works. To understand the ancient humans who seem to choose strength over intelligence, it helps to begin by removing the false contrast. The old popular image is simple because it is flattering. It imagines modern humans as the clever ones and their vanished cousins as the powerful ones, as though the ancient world were divided cleanly between muscle and mind. But the evidence has never supported anything so neat. What the Ice Age record gives us instead is something more interesting and more unsettling. Different human populations solving the same brutal problems in different ways, with bodies and behaviours shaped by climate, geography, prey, risk, and time. Some of those solutions lean heavily on physical robustness. Some appear to favour broader networks, lighter bodies, or greater flexibility. Scholars still debate how sharp those differences really were, and the evidence remains incomplete. But one truth stands out with unusual clarity. There were ancient humans whose bodies were built for force on a scale that is difficult for modern people to imagine, and those bodies were not accidents. They were answers. The stage for this story is not a single cave or valley, but a vast belt of territory stretching across Ice Age Europe and Western Asia, then outward into neighbouring regions where climate shifts redraw the map again and again. Glaciers advance and retreat. Grasslands open where forests once stood, then shrink back. Rivers change course. Sea levels drop, exposing land bridges and coastlines that no longer exist. Mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, steppe bison, reindeer, horses, and red deer fill different ecological zones, and human groups must learn the rhythm of each. These landscapes are not empty, and they are not stable. They pulse. A valley rich in prey for generations can become barren within a few centuries. A corridor of migration can close. A familiar shelter can become useless when the wind shifts and the game no longer passes below it. The humans who survive here do so by enduring pressure that is constant even when it's not dramatic. They live where every day demands calories, attention, memory, and physical effort. Long before the last ice age reaches its coldest extremes, earlier human species have already been meeting these demands in different forms. By the time Neanderthals emerge in Europe and parts of Asia, their lineage has deep roots in colder and more seasonal environments. They do not appear suddenly as monsters of brute force. They are the result of long adaptation. One branch of the human family becoming increasingly specialized for the demands of Eurasia outside the warmer zones where earlier humans first evolved. Their bodies shorten and widen, their limbs become powerfully built, their joints grow large, their chests expand into deep barrels that likely help support high oxygen demands and heavy workloads. Even the architecture of the skeleton suggests repeated mechanical stress from a life of lifting, hauling, climbing, gripping, butchering, thrusting, and surviving impact. This is a human form engineered not by theory, but by attrition. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. One of the strange habits of modern thinking is to confuse comfort with normality. We assume the body we know is the standard human body, and everything else is a deviation from it. But for most of human history, the normal state is not comfort, it is exposure, it is uncertainty, it is the need to cross rough ground with no guarantee of return. In that context, a heavy frame is not a burden by default. It can be a form of stored advantage. Shorter limbs help conserve heat in cold climates. Thick cortical bone helps withstand repeated strain. Great hand strength is useful when shaping wood, scraping hides, carrying meat, and controlling weapons designed for close contact. A wide pelvis and powerful legs stabilize the body on uneven terrain. No single explanation fully accounts for this anatomy, but taken together, the pattern suggests a population under selection for resilience, not elegance. Their world rewards toughness with another season of life. Yet physical power alone is never enough to explain survival, and this is where the story becomes richer. Even among the most robust ancient humans, strength is not mindless. A body shaped for force still belongs to a brain that must track herd movement across seasons, read weather from subtle signs, remember the location of stone sources, recognize edible plants in the correct window, and maintain bonds within a group small enough that every injury matters. Ancient humans do not survive by charging blindly into prey. They survive by knowing when to move, when to wait, where to shelter, how to divide effort, and how to protect the vulnerable members of the group. Some sites suggest repeated occupation over long intervals, implying memory of place. Others show careful stoneworking traditions passed across generations. Even broken bones can hint at survival after serious injury, which in turn suggest care from others. The old insult that imagines robust humans as living battering rams says more about modern arrogance than about prehistory. Still, the body tells its own story with unusual force. When paleoanthropologists recover Neanderthal skeletons, one of the striking patterns is how often the bones seem to record a hard life. There are healed fractures, worn joints, thick muscle attachments, and signs of repeated trauma. Some researchers have compared parts of this injury pattern to that seen in people who handle dangerous large animals at close range. The comparison is imperfect, as all such analogies are, but the implication is hard to miss. These humans do not merely inhabit a cold landscape, they collide with it. They meet large prey at distances where mistakes are catastrophic. They absorb punishment. They continue. There is something deeply sober in that evidence. Survival here is not abstract. It leaves marks. And this marks the beginning of the mystery. Because if one human lineage becomes so physically capable, so remarkably suited to a world of direct confrontation and relentless stress, why does that same lineage not endure everywhere? Why? After hundreds of thousands of years of adaptation, does this kind of body eventually disappear as a dominant human form? It is tempting to answer too quickly. Modern humans won because they were smarter. Strong humans lost because they were less advanced. That explanation is clean, flattering, and probably wrong in its simplicity. What survives in the record suggests something far more complicated, a world changing fast enough that former strengths become expensive, narrow, or fragile under new conditions. But that turning point lies ahead, at the beginning, in the long age when cold defines the terms of life. Strength is not a tragic flaw. It is an achievement. Imagine the ordinary labour of a single week in one of these groups. A hunting party travels miles over frozen ground, perhaps tracking reindeer, perhaps moving toward a place where horses are known to gather, perhaps following a migration route learned over generations. Weapons must be carried. Fire materials must be protected. A carcass, once taken, must be opened quickly before scavengers arrive, or the cold changes the texture of flesh and sinew. Meat must be stripped, limbs separated, marrow extracted, hide bundled, valuable fat and organs preserved, stone tools resharpened, wood shafts maintained. The journey back is slower, heavier, and still dangerous. Then comes the work of processing, drying, scraping, cooking, sharing, and planning the next move. Even without a dramatic hunt scene, the total physical demand is immense. A strongly built body is not merely useful in moments of danger. It pays for itself in the exhausting continuity of life. The children of such groups grow up in that same continuity. They watch adults read tracks and skies. They learn the habits of animals before they can fully join the hunt. They understand terrain not as scenery but as instruction. A gully channels wind. A ridge offers sight lines. A cave mouth faces the wrong direction and steals warmth. A valley floor floods in thaw season. Knowledge accumulates through repetition. But repetition takes place inside a body culture where competence is inseparable from endurance. To be useful is to be able to carry, cut, climb, drag, strike, stay awake, keep warm, and keep moving. There is intelligence in every part of this. But it is intelligence fused to action so tightly that modern people often fail to see it, unless it leaves symbolic artifacts behind. That failure of perception has shaped the reputation of ancient humans for generations. Early reconstructions often exaggerated the difference between robust archaic humans and ourselves, presenting them as half-beast, half-man figures staggering through a primitive world. As archaeological evidence improved, that image weakened, but some version of it remains stubbornly alive. It survives because it tells a pleasing story about progress, a story in which the past must look crude so the present can feel superior. But the deeper one looks, the less convincing that becomes. The ancient humans of Ice Age Eurasia are not failed moderns. They are not experiments gone wrong. They are successful people of a different pattern, made by different pressures. Their bodies store one of the clearest messages evolution ever writes. Survival has a cost, and that cost is paid in flesh as much as in ideas. There is also a darker side to such specialization. A body optimized for power and cold tolerance is likely expensive to run. Large muscles demand energy. Heavy frames require more food. High activity in harsh climates increases daily caloric needs. This cost may not matter much when ecosystems remain productive enough, and hunting knowledge stays well matched to the land. But any disruption, whether from climate instability, declining prey reliability, competition, or shifting habitats, will hit such populations hard. For now, though, that danger is only a shadow at the edge of the story. In the long middle stretch of their existence, these strong humans are not fading relics. They are masters of a demanding niche. And so the image sharpens. Somewhere in the Pleistocene cold, under a sky already dimming toward evening, a small group bends over the work that keeps it alive. Breath steams in the air, stone bites tendon, hands redden and stiffen. A child watches from near the shelter. Someone feeds the fire. Someone scans the horizon. The bodies gathered there are compact, powerful, and built for a world that punishes the weak without hesitation. They do not know they will one day be studied as symbols of an evolutionary wager. They do not know later humans will imagine them choosing strength, as if intelligence were the road not taken. They know only the ground beneath their feet, the cold in their lungs, the weight they can carry, and the people who must eat before morning. In that world, strength is not vanity. It is memory turned into muscle, climate turned into bone, and necessity turned into the shape of a human life. Once the outline gives us the shape of the story, the bones begin to matter more than the names. Long before any scholar calls them Neanderthals, long before they become symbols in modern arguments about intelligence, progress, or extinction, these ancient humans are living inside bodies unlike our own in ways that are both subtle and profound. A modern human skeleton, even a strong one, usually looks comparatively narrow, lighter, and more elongated. The robust humans of Ice Age Eurasia often look as though they are built from denser material. Their ribs sweep outward into a broad, deep chest. Their shoulders and upper arms suggest enormous leverage. Their hands are powerful, with thick finger bones and attachments for muscles used in forceful gripping. Their thighs and lower legs are short relative to the body, a feature that helps conserve heat in cold climates. Their joints are large. Their bones are not simply thick in a crude sense, but shaped by the repeated strains of a life in which impact, lifting, and intense physical exertion are ordinary. This is anatomy written by pressure over immense time. The cold explains part of it, but not all of it. In modern biology, there are broad patterns showing that mammals in colder climates often evolve more compact bodies. A shorter, stockier build helps reduce heat loss, and a large torso helps retain warmth. That framework has often been used to explain why Neanderthals and some related populations look the way they do, and it likely captures an important truth. But climate alone cannot account for the full picture. The upper body in particular appears exceptionally strong, even beyond what simple heat conservation would predict. The forearms, shoulders, and hands suggest repeated close work requiring force and control. The teeth, in some cases, appear to have served almost like an extra tool hand, gripping hides or fibers during processing. Where patterns on the front teeth point to frequent use in tasks that demanded both strength and precision. What survives in the record suggests not only cold-adapted humans, but humans whose daily labour placed unusual demands on the whole body. There is something revealing in the face as well. The large nasal opening of Neanderthals has often attracted attention, sometimes surrounded by overconfident explanations. Some researchers have linked it to warming and humidifying cold, dry air before it reaches the lungs. Others caution that facial shape is influenced by many factors, and no single explanation fully accounts for it. That warning matters, because prehistory is full of theories that sound plausible, but later prove too neat. Still, even with that caution, the general pattern remains striking. These are people whose bodies seem intensely committed to keeping themselves functional in severe environments. Everything about the skeleton implies a life in which the body is not an afterthought to survival, but one of its main instruments. Muscle itself does not fossilize. Yet the places where muscles attach to bone can hint at the power once carried there. On robust, archaic skeletons, these attachment sites are often pronounced, especially in the arm and shoulders. This does not mean every individual is a giant by modern fantasy standards. Many were not especially tall. In fact, Neanderthals were often shorter than recent modern human averages. But compactness should not be mistaken for weakness. A shorter, powerfully muscled body can generate tremendous force, especially at close range. The image that emerges is not of towering warriors, but of sturdy, durable humans whose strength lies in leverage, density, and endurance. They are built low and broad, like people meant to resist the world rather than glide through it. That physical pattern may also reflect the tempo of their lives. A modern body can be trained for specific tasks, but much of what we call lifestyle is buffered by technology. Ancient humans have fewer such buffers. The ground is harder, loads are carried by hand, surfaces are uneven, shelter is partial. Food acquisition itself is labor. Under those conditions, the distinction between biology and habit begins to blur. A lineage can evolve certain broad proportions, but those inherited forms are then reinforced by development inside a world of constant work. Children growing up in such societies would not only inherit robust bodies, they would grow into them through repeated exertion, learning movement in terrain that demands balance, force, and caution at once. Every generation would inhabit the same conversation between genes and labor. Scholars still debate exactly how much of Neanderthal robustness is inherited adaptation and how much reflects developmental response to strenuous lives, but both almost certainly matter. The evidence remains incomplete because skeletons are never the whole population. Preservation is uneven, samples are small, individuals vary, yet enough remains to reveal a pattern that is hard to dismiss. These humans are not simply modern people with rougher features. Their body plan is distinct. It reflects a branch of humanity that has spent a very long time being shaped by the demands of glacial and near-glacial Eurasia. Even the inner ear, the rib cage, the pelvis, and the growth trajectory of the bones suggest developmental pathways that differ from our own in meaningful ways. One lesser-known detail is how early that difference appears in childhood. Studies of Neanderthal remains suggest that some aspects of their body form emerge quite young. They are not merely modern human infants who grow into heavier adults through hard use. The developmental blueprint itself appears different. That matters because it means their physicality is not just cultural habit or environmental damage layered on a familiar human frame. It is a deeper pattern, one rooted in lineage. Their childhood is still human, still social, still dependent on care and learning, but it unfolds toward a body that prepares for a different balance of demands. They are being built, from early on, for a world where weight, torque, and thermal stress must be managed constantly. This does not mean that every aspect of their anatomy is perfectly adapted in the engineering sense. Evolution is never so clean. A trait can persist because it is good enough, because it is linked to other useful traits, or because its costs only become severe under certain changing conditions. But during the long periods when Neanderthals and other robust archaic humans flourish, their bodies appear not as evolutionary mistakes but as working solutions. They endure hundreds of thousands of years across enormous environmental variability. That span alone should make us careful. A lineage that survives that long has not misunderstood its world. It has matched it, again and again, with enough success to remain humanly present through repeated climatic violence. There is also the matter of pain. Fossils do not record sensation directly, but they do record damage, healing, and repetition. Some Neanderthal skeletons carry signs of healed fractures that would have been debilitating even with modern medicine. Broken ribs, arm injuries, cranial trauma, degenerative joint changes, and other signs of bodily stress appear often enough to suggest that hardship is structural, not exceptional. Yet many of these individuals live long enough for those injuries to heal at least partially. That implies support. A badly injured hunter does not survive alone in an Ice Age winter. Someone carries food. Someone tends the fire. Someone protects the injured from exposure and predators. Strength, then, is never merely individual. It exists inside a social frame. The powerful body survives because the group makes its survival possible when that body fails. This is one of the most important corrections to the old stereotype. Robust ancient humans are often imagined as solitary brutes, but every serious line of evidence points away from that. Heavy-bodied humans living under high risk require planning and cooperation simply to persist. Fire must be maintained. Young must be raised for years. Stone must be procured from useful sources. Carcasses must be processed efficiently. Injured members must sometimes be sustained. The archaeological record does not always tell us how these decisions were made, and scholars still debate the scale and complexity of their social networks, but the image of isolated muscle without social intelligence is untenable. These are bodies forged by collective survival as much as by individual strain, and yet collective survival does not erase the particular demands of that body type. A broad chest and heavy limbs require fuel. High muscle mass increases baseline energy needs. In cold environments, those needs rise further. This means that robust humans are not only skilled hunters and gatherers, they are also costly organisms. A bad season hurts them in biological ways that may be especially severe. If prey thins out, if mobility becomes more difficult, if foraging returns drop, or if competition increases, such bodies become expensive to maintain. That trade-off is central to the whole story, but here in the earlier phase it still works in their favour. Their world is dangerous enough, and close-range labour frequent enough, that the payoff remains real. Another surprising detail comes from the microscopic and chemical traces sometimes preserved in teeth and bones. These can offer hints about diet, stress, and even aspects of local ecology. Results vary from site to site, as they should in populations spread across wide regions and long periods. But they often reinforce a picture of highly active humans, deeply tuned to local conditions. Some groups appear to rely heavily on large animal protein. Others show a more mixed use of plants and smaller resources than older stereotypes allowed. This matters because the strong ancient human is not simply a meat-driven caricature. He or she is part of a flexible subsistence system, even if that flexibility may not ultimately match that of later Homo sapiens. The record keeps resisting simple binaries. The more closely one looks, the stranger the phrase chose strength over intelligence begins to sound. No ancient human chooses in that moralized, modern sense. There is no meeting at which one species decides to invest in muscle while another chooses brains. What happens instead is more gradual and more tragic. Different populations move through different landscapes under different constraints, and over long time spans those constraints shape bodies, habits, and vulnerabilities. In one setting, a strongly built frame is a profound advantage. In another, or under changing conditions, that same frame may limit mobility, increase calorie demands, or tie a population to methods of hunting and survival that become harder to sustain. The body is both a gift and a commitment. That commitment can be seen in almost every part of Neanderthal life. Their skeletons are not general purpose in the way ours may appear to be. They look tuned. Their limbs, trunk, and craniofacial form all suggest a lineage leaning hard into one suite of solutions. This is why they fascinate modern observers. We recognize them as human, unmistakably so. And yet we also sense that they represent another possible version of being human, one less dependent on range, lightness, and perhaps social breadth, and more dependent on direct force, local mastery, and bodily endurance. The evidence is never complete enough to make that contrast absolute, but it is strong enough to matter. Imagine standing beside one of them, not in a museum where bone becomes specimen, but in the living cold of their own world. The first thing noticed might not even be their difference, but their solidity, the way they occupy space, the economy of motion in someone accustomed to conserving heat and effort, the confidence of a body that knows how much strain it can absorb, hands scarred by hide work and stone, shoulders conditioned for thrust, hauling, and repeated impact, breath moving through a chest built like a shelter wall. None of this belongs to a dull creature. It belongs to a specialist, one of the strongest humans ever to live, shaped by a world in which strength is not decoration but infrastructure, and for a very long time, that infrastructure holds. Power reveals itself most clearly at short distance, not in the abstract, not in the museum reconstruction, but in the instant when a large animal turns, kicks, charges, or simply refuses to die quickly. Across Ice Age Eurasia, many of the great prey species are not passive sources of meat waiting to be collected. They are dangerous bodies in motion, reindeer in numbers vast enough to reshape a plain, wild horses that can bolt and crush, bison with explosive strength, giant deer with antlers that command space, and in some regions mammoths or woolly rhinoceroses whose very presence changes the emotional scale of the landscape. To hunt such animals is to enter a contest where planning matters, but where there are moments when everything reduces to impact, nerve, and the ability to hold one's ground long enough for the strike to count. In that narrow interval between approach and death, a strongly built human body becomes more than useful. It becomes a survival system. Archaeology cannot film these hunts for us. No complete scene survives. What remains are stone points, butchered bones, kill sites, fractures, residues, and the arrangement of bodies in a place long after weather and scavengers have done their work. Yet taken together, these fragments suggest a world in which at least some ancient humans, especially Neanderthals, often hunted at perilously close range. The old spear is central here, for many years. Discussion of Neanderthal hunting centered on whether they mainly used thrusting spears rather than long-range projectile weapons. The distinction matters because it implies very different relationships to danger. A thrusting spear demands proximity. It places the hunter within the reach of horns, hooves, and panic. A projectile, by contrast, extends the body outward and allows force at safer distance. Scholars still debate how varied Neanderthal weapon systems were, and some recent evidence suggests they may have used more range and sophistication than older models allowed, but the broader pattern remains persuasive. Much of their hunting appears to have involved closing the gap. That gap is where the body tells the truth. A broad shoulder girdle, powerful forearms, strong hands, and a compact frame are all useful in close contact encounters. They help steady a spear, absorb recoil, control sudden force, and recover balance on difficult ground. They matter when an injured animal twists sideways in a wash of mud and blood, when the hunter must drive in again or pull back fast enough to avoid being caught beneath weight and panic. A lighter-bodied human can also be brave. Of course. But bravery does not erase mechanics. When life repeatedly brings humans into this distance from large prey, mechanical advantage matters enormously. It shapes the injuries they survive, the techniques they favour, the confidence they build, and perhaps even the way they understand the land. One of the more sobering clues comes from the trauma patterns found on Neanderthal skeletons. Some researchers have noted similarities between these injury patterns and those seen in modern people who experience close encounters with large animals, such as rodeo riders or those in similarly high-impact situations. The comparison should be used carefully. Ancient hunting is not a rodeo, and fossil samples are small and biased. But the rough resemblance still hints at a life in which the body repeatedly absorbs violent force. Broken ribs, head injuries, arm fractures, and other skeletal damage suggest not occasional freak accidents, but an entire mode of subsistence structured around risk. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for every injury. Some damage could come from falls, fights, accidents, or other labour, but taken together, the pattern fits a world where meat often has to be won in dangerous proximity. That danger changes the emotional atmosphere of the hunt. Modern minds, shaped by screens and distance, often imagine hunting as observation followed by clean execution. Ice Age hunting is more intimate than that. It begins far earlier in tracking, patience, and knowledge of terrain. Hunters must know where animals pass in certain seasons, where snow crust will hold, where marsh or ravine can trap movement, where wind will carry scent away, where a herd is likely to bunch or break. They may drive animals toward narrow places, ambush them along migration routes, isolate the weak, or strike when a group is hemmed in by terrain. Intelligence lives in every stage of that process. But when the moment comes, planning narrows into violent contact. If the first strike does not disable, the prey remains a threat. If the terrain shifts underfoot, the hunt can turn into injury or death. The group survives by reducing uncertainty as much as possible, but uncertainty never disappears. This is why strength and intelligence make such poor opposites in prehistoric life. A close-range hunt requires both. It requires memory of place, coordination with others, timing, and nerve. But it also demands a body capable of forceful precision. There is nothing primitive in this combination. In some ways it is more demanding than reliance on greater distance, because the margin for bodily failure is so much smaller. Ancient hunters do not enter these situations because they are too dull to invent safer methods. They enter them because this is the system they know, the ecology they inhabit, and the set of tools and bodies through which their lineage has become successful. What survives in the record suggests specialists at work, not reckless amateurs. And there are reasons such a strategy might endure for a very long time. Large game offers extraordinary returns when successfully taken. One major kill can feed a group, provide fat in a landscape where fat is precious, supply hide for clothing or shelter lining, produce bone and sinew for tools, and justify substantial cooperative effort. In cold environments especially, large herbivores can be living storehouses of calories moving through open terrain. If a human population becomes good at hunting them regularly, the rewards are immense. Even danger can become normalized when it is culturally embedded and repeatedly managed. Skills pass from one generation to the next. Younger hunters learn approach distances, angles of movement, signs of panic, and the physical feel of holding a weapon steady at the moment an animal commits its weight. What looks to outsiders like madness may look from inside the culture like competence. Some archaeological sites strengthen that sense of practice competence. There are places where animal remains appear in concentrations that suggest repeated use of local features for hunting and butchery. Caves, rock shelters, valley constrictions, and open-air sites near migration routes sometimes show that humans return to the same landscapes again and again. This is not random scavenging across empty wilderness. It is patterned exploitation of terrain, guided by memory. One lesser-known but revealing point is that some kill or processing sites seem logistically organized in ways that imply planned movement between activity areas. Animals are not always consumed where they fall. Parts are selected, transported, and processed according to circumstance. That requires judgment not only about prey, but about time, weight, distance, and future need. In other words, it requires minds deeply engaged with consequences. Even so, the physics of close-range hunting leave traces that words can barely soften. A wounded bison does not care about human intelligence. A cornered horse can crush ribs. A mammoth, even if targeted under special conditions rather than routinely, is not merely prey but landscape with intention. To stand near such creatures armed with wood and stone is to accept a level of exposure modern people rarely confront. It helps explain why robust bodies are so repeatedly associated with this world. Thick bones and heavy muscles do not guarantee safety, but they help. They absorb strain. They allow forceful repetition. They make dragging, lifting, and butchering less ruinous. They can turn the odds slightly in favor of a small, coordinated group against animals much larger and stronger than any one human. The work does not end with the kill. In some ways, the kill is only the beginning of another race against danger. Carcasses attract scavengers. Weather can ruin access. Darkness reduces safety. Valuable tissues must be removed quickly. Bones may need to be broken for marrow. Skins must be cut cleanly enough to be useful later. Internal organs can offer immediate nutrition. Limbs and meat-bearing portions must be divided according to what can be carried. Every decision has a weight cost. Every extra trip increases risk. This is where bodily strength becomes mundane infrastructure again. A person able to shoulder heavy loads over rough ground expands the practical radius of the hunt. A group with several such people can transport more, waste less, and survive leaner periods with better reserves. It is easy to romanticize the dramatic moment of the strike, but often the true value of strength appears in the long labor that follows. There is also reason to think that ancient humans knew their prey as more than categories. Reindeer are not bison. Horses do not move like red deer. Seasonal fat content changes. Migration timing matters. Weather alters herd cohesion. Breeding cycles affect behavior and vulnerability. Hunters who persist for generations in one region accumulate a detailed practical zoology. Even if it is never written down, they learn not only how to kill, but when not to try, which animals are worth the cost, and how landscape can do part of the work. In this sense, the hunt becomes an alliance between mind, memory, body, and place. The stronger human body is only one part of the system, but it is a decisive part when the final meters collapse and the animal is suddenly close enough to smell. Some researchers have argued that Neanderthals may have relied too heavily on these close-quarters methods, and that this later limited their adaptability when climates and ecosystems became less predictable. That may prove partly true, but it must not be projected backward too early. For long stretches of time, this mode of life works. It works not accidentally, but repeatedly. It creates skilled hunters who know how to read open country and wooded edges, how to commit force without wasting it, and how to take from the land what weaker or less coordinated groups might fail to secure. If later this strength becomes costly, that does not erase the centuries in which it is effective. It only makes the eventual shift more tragic. There is something almost paradoxical in this. The more dangerous the hunt, the more intelligence it demands beforehand. Yet because the final act happens at close range, later observers often remember only the physical part. They see the heavy spear and imagine a simple mind behind it. But the record suggests something else, a human population whose intelligence is embodied differently, expressed not mainly in distant symbolic accumulation, but in situational mastery, forceful technique, an intimate knowledge of prey behavior. Scholars still debate the full range of Neanderthal hunting technologies, and new discoveries continue to complicate old models. But no matter how those debates settle, the basic fact remains. These were humans who often lived by entering danger at arm's length. Picture the plain again near dusk, but now not after the hunt, rather in the moments before it breaks open. Frost tightens underfoot, breath clouds the air, the herd shifts, uncertain, bunching toward a slope or bottleneck where escape narrows. The hunters are silent. They know the ground. They know the wind. They know the animal in front of them not as symbol but as force, weight, and future survival. Then movement, a rush of bodies, the first impact of hooves, a spear held low and steady, arms and shoulders absorbing the shock, everything learned over years collapsing into seconds. In that world, intelligence does not stand apart from strength, it passes through it. And for ancient humans built to survive the moment when prey becomes collision, that union is one of the clearest reasons they endure as long as they do. The old insult says they were strong because they were simple. It is one of those ideas that survives not because the evidence supports it, but because it flatters the people repeating it. Once a vanished human population is assigned the role of the brute, every heavy bone becomes proof of dullness, every close-range hunt becomes evidence of limited imagination, and every difference from ourselves becomes a deficiency. Yet the closer the record is examined, the less stable that picture becomes. These ancient humans do not leave behind the kind of overwhelming symbolic flood associated with later Upper Paleolithic Homo sapiens, and that fact matters. But absence of abundance is not absence of mind. A quieter record is still a record. What survives from caves, open-air sites, tools, pigments, burials, adhesives, bones, and the organization of space suggests intelligence that is practical, social, adaptable within limits, and deeply tied to embodied life. Strength and thought are not opposing forces here. They are braided together so tightly that separating them becomes a modern mistake. Even the simplest act in the archaeological record often conceals layers of cognition. A stone tool is not merely a sharp edge. It is the end point of selecting the right raw material, recognizing fracture properties, carrying or revisiting known sources, shaping flakes in sequence, and maintaining the tool during use. Different Neanderthal-associated tool traditions, including the widely discussed Mousterian industries, show consistent methods that vary by region and time. Such consistency implies learning, memory, and transmission. It may not look like a library, but it is a tradition. It is knowledge stabilized across generations through repeated instruction and imitation. Scholars still debate how conservative or innovative these tool traditions were compared with those of the later Homo sapiens, but no serious reading of the evidence supports the notion of a mind trapped in instinct alone. There are also signs that Neanderthals and related populations understood materials in ways that go beyond crude improvisation. Some sites preserve evidence of compound tool-making, including adhesives such as birch tar used to haft stone points onto shafts or handles. birch tar is not a substance that simply appears by accident in usable form. Producing it requires an understanding, whether explicit or tradition-bound, of controlled heating under specific conditions. The exact methods used remain debated because the evidence is fragmentary, but the existence of such adhesives matters. It suggests planning, process control, and an ability to transform the natural properties of materials into more effective tools. That is intelligence made visible through chemistry and craft, not through writing or monuments. Fire tells a similar story. Maintaining fire in harsh climates is not trivial. It is one thing to benefit from a natural blaze. It is another to preserve combustion, transport embers, choose fuel, manage smoke, and decide where heat should be concentrated inside a shelter. Repeated evidence of hearth use at many sites indicates not merely opportunistic warmth, but structured dependence. Fire changes food, protects against predators, extends useful time into darkness, softens materials, alters stone in some contexts, and anchors social life. The hearth is a technological centre long before history writes about cities. To keep one alive through long cold seasons requires foresight and discipline. It requires people who understand that survival tomorrow depends on attention tonight. Social care may be even more revealing than technology. Some of the most striking fossils associated with Neanderthals show individuals who survived serious injuries or long-term impairments. A body with major trauma, damaged limbs, or reduced mobility does not continue for years in Ice Age conditions without assistance. Food must be shared, movement must be adjusted, shelter and protection must be extended to someone temporarily or permanently less productive. Of course, each case must be treated carefully. The archaeological record is never as generous as the stories we want to tell from it. Yet enough examples exist to suggest that care is not impossible or rare. What survives in the record suggests communities in which the value of a person is not measured only in immediate physical output. That, too, is intelligence. It is social intelligence, the ability to carry memory, loyalty, and practical compassion through difficult conditions. Then there is the matter of hunting itself, so often used as evidence against them. Yet close-range hunting, as the last section makes clear, is not the method of a species too stupid to stand farther away. It is the method of people operating within a specific package of bodies, tools, prey behaviours, and inherited competence. To coordinate a hunt, select a moment of attack, manage fear, and process the aftermath efficiently requires minds that can anticipate consequences across time. A hunting party must remember routes, understand animal behaviour, assess weather, and read the condition of companions. None of this leaves poetry carved on bone, but none of it is mindless. The intelligence is there, distributed across action. One lesser-known and often misunderstood part of the story concerns symbolic behaviour. For many years, symbolic thought was treated as the decisive property that separated Homo sapiens from everyone else, with ornaments, pigments, engravings, and possible burials used as a kind of cognitive border fence. That border has become harder to defend. Several sites associated with Neanderthals have produced pigments, modified feathers or claws, possible personal ornaments, and evidence that some bodies may have been intentionally placed rather than simply abandoned. Each case is contested in detail, and caution is necessary. Scholars still debate how frequent, how elaborate, and how unambiguous such behaviours really were. The evidence remains incomplete, but even cautious interpretation now allows something that older narratives resisted. Neanderthals may have engaged in forms of symbolism, body decoration, or mortuary attention at least occasionally. If so, then their minds moved not only through utility, but also through meaning. Language remains one of the great uncertainties. No recording survives, and no fossil can tell us exactly what words were spoken around an Ice Age fire. Yet several lines of evidence suggest that Neanderthals likely possessed some form of spoken language, perhaps complex, though its structure can never be fully recovered. Their social lives, coordinated hunts, care for the injured, technological traditions, and likely teaching all become easier to explain if language exists in substantial form. Anatomical clues, including aspects of the hyoid bone and hearing range, have sometimes been brought into this discussion, though interpretations vary and should not be overstated. No single piece of evidence proves language as we know it. Still, the old image of silent, grunting beings shuffling through the cold is increasingly difficult to defend. A social species surviving under these conditions almost certainly communicates richly, even if the exact nature of that communication is beyond our reach. What may differ, and perhaps differ profoundly, is not whether intelligence exists, but how it is distributed and expressed. Modern humans often generate large, extended social networks, exchange materials over long distances, and produce abundant symbolic artifacts that make cognitive life archaeologically visible. Neanderthals seem, at least much of the time, to have lived in smaller, more localized populations with denser attachment to particular regions. If that is true, then intelligence might have been directed less toward broad networking and long-range abstraction, and more toward local mastery, immediate cooperation, and embodied skill. This is an inference, not a certainty. But it helps explain why comparing minds through artifact counts alone can be misleading. A species that stores more of its intelligence in social memory, practical skill, and local ecological knowledge may look quieter in the archaeological record than one that externalizes more of thought into portable symbols and broader exchange. Their brains complicate the stereotype further. Neanderthal cranial capacity falls within, and sometimes above, the range of modern humans. Brain size alone proves very little, and crude comparisons are dangerous. Different body sizes create different baseline needs, and neural organization matters more than raw volume. But the simple idea that these robust humans were merely under-brain collapses immediately under the evidence. They have large brains, large bodies, demanding environments, and complex tasks. The more serious question is not whether they were intelligent, but whether the ecological and social world they inhabited rewarded the same kind of flexible expansion later associated with Homo sapiens. Intelligence, after all, is not a single ladder. It is a cluster of capacities that matter differently in different worlds. That difference may even shape how children learned. In small groups under harsh conditions, knowledge must be transmitted efficiently and often through direct participation. Young individuals would watch adults scrape hides, retouch tools, prepare shafts, identify tracks, process food, and manage fire. They would learn not in classrooms but in landscapes. Teaching can happen without formal institutions and still be highly structured. Gesture, demonstration, correction, repetition, and perhaps language all carry skill into the next generation. There is nothing simplistic in that. Indeed, much of human competence everywhere has always depended on this form of apprenticeship. The robust body, then, is not evidence against culture. It is one of culture's main instruments. And yet the phrase worked differently matters. It is possible that Neanderthal intelligence, while fully human in many respects, was embedded in a narrower demographic and social pattern. Smaller, More isolated populations can preserve deep local expertise while losing innovations more easily. They can know a valley intimately and still struggle when rapid climatic change reorganizes a continent. They can be brilliant at surviving one world and less able to improvise across another. No single explanation fully accounts for later outcomes. But demography matters because intelligence is not only what an individual brain can do, it is also what groups can preserve, share, accumulate, and recover after setbacks. A scattered population may be cognitively rich and still historically vulnerable. This is where the false opposition between strength and intelligence finally begins to dissolve. The ancient humans of this story are not an example of muscle replacing mind. They are an example of mind expressed through a body and way of life that later humans often fail to value properly. Their intelligence is visible in the control of fire, the shaping of tools, the use of materials, the management of risk, the care of the injured, the probable use of language, and the hints of symbolic behavior that refuse to vanish from the record. At the same time, that intelligence may be constrained by smaller numbers, tighter local attachment, and a survival strategy that invests heavily in direct physical competence. The tension is not between body and brain. It is between different ways of being human under pressure. Imagine again the people gathered in evening light after the hunt. The work is not chaotic, tools are laid where hands can find them. Meat is divided with purpose. A child watches and learns without anyone naming the lesson. Someone tends the fire. Someone cleans an edge. Someone remembers where a better stone source lies beyond the ridge. Someone notices weather turning in the smell of the air. There may be pigment on skin. A feather kept for reasons we cannot recover. A body placed carefully when death comes. A sound or word repeated across generations and now forever lost. These are not signs of a species that lacked intelligence. They are signs of intelligence living in forms that later history does not always preserve equally. The real mystery is not why they were strong. The mystery is how long we allowed ourselves to imagine that strength could only exist where thought was weak. A powerful body is an advantage only so long as the world continues to pay for it. That is the quiet arithmetic behind all specialization, and it is rarely visible at first because success hides cost so well. When prey is available, when movement patterns remain legible, when climates stay within the range a population knows how to survive, strength looks almost free. A broad chest means stamina in the cold. Dense muscle means force in the hunt. Heavy bones mean resilience under strain. A compact build holds heat and absorbs punishment. Each trait seems to justify itself in daily life, and for long stretches of prehistory it probably does. But evolution never hands out gifts without invoices. A body built for power is expensive tissue. It must be warmed, fed, repaired, and carried through every lean season. The same anatomy that once turns danger into opportunity can become a constant drain the moment the environment grows less predictable. This cost begins with calories. Neanderthals and other robust archaic humans are not large in the sense of height alone, but they are metabolically demanding. A compact, muscular body in a cold climate consumes energy at a relentless rate. Just staying warm takes fuel. Walking over difficult terrain with that body takes more. Hunting large prey takes more still. Processing carcasses, carrying loads, maintaining shelter, recovering from injury, gestating and feeding children, surviving illness. All of it adds to a budget that cannot be postponed. Food is not merely nourishment here. It is structural necessity. A missed opportunity is not inconvenient. It threatens the body directly, Because there is so little spare margin between intake and expenditure when life is organised around constant physical labour, researchers have tried to estimate the energetic needs of Neanderthals, and while exact numbers remain debated, the broad picture is consistent. Their daily requirements were likely high, especially for active males in cold environments, but by no means limited to them. Females, children, elders, and the injured all form part of the same economic problem. In a small group, every mouth matters. The energetic load of children is long-term, because human offspring remain dependent for years. Elder care or injury care adds further strain. A robust adult body can secure large returns when hunting succeeds, but the entire social unit depends on those returns staying regular enough to support everyone. The evidence remains incomplete, yet what survives in bones, habitats, and likely prey use suggests populations living close to biological necessity. There is little room for sustained failure. Cold sharpens the problem. Modern people often think of cold mainly as discomfort, but in evolutionary terms, cold is an invisible tax. It increases maintenance costs hour by hour. It reduces the availability of certain plant foods. It raises the risks of inactivity, exposure, and injury. It turns clothing, shelter, and fire into metabolic tools. The body answers part of this challenge with its own design-shortened limbs, deep torsos, insulation through behavior and clothing, perhaps changes in circulation or daily rhythms. But those answers are not free. Every adaptation that helps conserve heat also locks the body more tightly into a certain ecological bargain. A stocky frame helps in winter, yet it must still be fed in late spring scarcity. Massive muscle can overpower prey, yet it also burns energy while sitting beside the fire. The stronger the body, the more urgently the landscape must continue to deliver. Diet becomes crucial here, and it is more complicated than older stereotypes suggested. For much of the 20th century, Neanderthals were often depicted as almost pure big-game carnivores, living on meat to a degree that made them seem nearly wolf-like. Recent evidence has softened that image without erasing its core. Isotopic analyses of some bones do suggest high reliance on animal protein, especially in colder regions, but dental calculus, plant residues, and regional variability show a broader range of foods in at least some settings. What survives in the record suggests that these humans could and did exploit plants, small game, and other resources more than once assumed. Still, the overall pattern remains one of high dependence on rich returns, especially from animals. That is not foolishness. In Ice Age ecosystems, large herbivores may offer the most efficient path to enough calories and fat, yet dependence on such resources carries a risk. When the prey base shifts, the body built around it feels the shock immediately. Fat matters as much as meat, and perhaps more in some seasons. Protein alone cannot sustain a human body indefinitely without causing serious physiological problems, especially when overall energy needs are high. Hunters in cold climates need fat as concentrated fuel, and many large animals provide it unevenly depending on season, age, and condition. This means that not all successful hunts are equal. A carcass rich in lean tissue but poor in fat may solve one problem while leaving another dangerously unresolved. Scholars still debate how consistently Neanderthals could buffer against these fluctuations, but no single explanation fully accounts for how they balanced this nutritional equation across all regions and periods. The challenge itself, however, is undeniable. A heavily built body does not merely need food, it needs the right food in enough quantity, and often under harsh timing constraints. The cost of the body also appears in mobility. A compact, muscular frame may be powerful, But power is not the same as efficient distance travel. Over short, difficult ground, such a body can be formidable. Over long distances, especially if landscapes become fragmented and resources patchier, that same build may become less economical. This is not to say Neanderthals were immobile. They clearly moved across substantial territories and knew them well. Stone transport and site distribution show planning across space. But if later environmental shifts require broader foraging radii, faster relocation, or more regular exchange between distant groups, then a body optimized for close-range force and thermal efficiency may no longer be ideal. What once fits one rhythm of movement may resist another. Injury adds another layer of cost. A strongly built body may withstand trauma better, but it does not escape trauma. Indeed, if the lifestyle associated with that body involves close-range hunting and intense physical labor, injuries may be frequent enough to become a recurring economic burden. Healing takes calories. Reduced mobility means reduced contribution. Pain limits effectiveness. Even if the group supports injured members, that support must come from somewhere. Every fracture that heals is evidence of care, but also evidence of strain placed on the community. When conditions are stable, such communities can likely carry those burdens. When conditions become volatile, the same obligations may turn into dangerous pressure points. Social intelligence can solve many problems, but not without resources. One lesser known but revealing angle on this problem comes from growth and life history. Neanderthals appear to have followed a developmental trajectory that is similar to ours in many broad respects. Yet there may have been meaningful differences in growth pace, maturation, and energetic allocation. The details remain debated, and the record is too incomplete for certainty. But even small shifts in growth timing can matter enormously in populations living near subsistence limits. The body of a child is already a future investment. If that body's maturing toward a robust adult form with high metabolic demands, the group is supporting an expensive future even before that individual becomes fully productive. This is not unusual in humans, who always pay heavily for long childhood, but it becomes sharper in groups where every adult body will be costly to maintain. And then there is weather. Not the grand climate trend discussed in textbooks, but weather as lived in stability, a late freeze, a poor migration season, too much snow crust, too little, unexpected thaw, river conditions changing at the wrong time, herds arriving weakened or not at all. Evolution works over long spans, but hunger works week to week. A specialized body feels short-term environmental noise more sharply than a more generalized one. If a population depends heavily on certain prey behaviors, certain landscapes, and certain energetic assumptions, then variability itself becomes an enemy. Not because the people are unintelligent, but because the buffer between success and failure is narrower than it appears from afar. There is a familiar temptation to describe this as nature-punishing brute force. That is not what is happening. The cost of a heavy body is not a moral lesson, it is a trade-off. For hundreds of thousands of years, it likely makes excellent evolutionary sense. The body of a Neanderthal is not a mistake waiting to be exposed. It is a system tightly matched to recurring problems. The tragedy only emerges later, when the recurrence breaks. A strategy built on high strength, close-range hunting, local knowledge, and expensive tissue can remain viable for ages and then become suddenly fragile when prey patterns change. Climates destabilize, or competitors with different strengths enter the same spaces. The very depth of adaptation becomes the source of vulnerability. The archaeological record sometimes hints at this pressure indirectly. Variation in prey choice, shifts in site use, or changes in occupation intensity may reflect changing returns or altered risk landscapes. Such signals are difficult to interpret, and scholars still debate how much any given pattern says about stress rather than normal fluctuation. The evidence remains incomplete because prehistory rarely gives neat before and after pictures, but even without dramatic collapse scenes, the metabolic logic is enough. A body with high demands cannot drift through scarcity for long. It must find more prey, or richer prey, or more predictable prey, or else begin to pay in health, fertility, and survival. This is where the phrase chose strength acquires its deepest irony. No ancient human consciously chooses this bargain, yet over evolutionary time, their lineage is committed to it more and more fully. They become people whose strength is inseparable from high maintenance costs, whose resilience depends on constant throughput from land to muscle. In good times, that bargain yields astonishing endurance. In bad times, it magnifies exposure, a lighter body, a wider diet, a broader social exchange network, or a more distance-based hunting toolkit may not look superior under all conditions, but when unpredictability increases, such traits can buy time. Time is often what evolution values most, because time allows recovery, movement, innovation, and survival through bad sequences. Imagine an Ice Age winter camp after several poor weeks. Nothing theatrical, no total famine, only an accumulating imbalance. The hunters still go out, the fire is still kept, there is still food, but less of it, and perhaps it is leaner than the body wants. Loads feel heavier on the return. The injured recover more slowly. Children are watched more closely. Decisions grow tighter. Which valley is still worth visiting? Whether to spend strength now for uncertain returns? Whether to move camp and risk exposure? In such moments, the powerful body is no longer just a weapon against the world. It is also a demand presented to the group every morning. Feed me, warm me, repair me, justify the investment again. For a long time the answer is yes. But history, and prehistory, often turn when the answer becomes harder to give. The world that shaped these strong ancient humans is never still, but there are times when its restlessness becomes something harsher than background pressure. The late Pleistocene does not unfold as one long frozen season. It pulses between cold and less cold, dry and less dry, open and wooded, with changes that can seem gradual across centuries and then startlingly abrupt in geological terms. Ice sheets expand and retreat. Winds shift the spread of dust across entire regions. Sea levels rise and fall. Grasslands break apart. Forests advance, then withdraw again. Rivers alter routes, and coastlines appear and vanish with the changing weight of water locked in ice. To us, this is climate history. To the humans living through it, it is the slow rearrangement of the terms of survival. A valley that once carried herds reliably may no longer do so. A migration corridor may narrow or close. Familiar prey may move farther, become less predictable, or be replaced by animals requiring different habits of pursuit. In a stable world, specialization becomes power. In an unstable one, specialization begins to shake. This instability matters because the ancient humans of our story do not merely occupy harsh landscapes. They are built around them. Their bodies, labor patterns, and hunting methods all assume a certain kind of ecological return. They do not need the world to be easy, but they do need it to remain legible. Legibility is one of the hidden conditions of survival. A hunter can endure danger if he knows where danger lives. A group can bear high caloric costs if prey movements still make sense across the seasons. A body can remain an advantage if the landscape continues rewarding its strengths often enough to offset its expense. What climate instability does, more than anything else, is erode legibility. It replaces known hardship with moving hardship. It turns knowledge from certainty into guesswork. The late Pleistocene supplies many such moments. Greenland ice cores, marine records, pollen sequences, loess deposits, and other lines of evidence show that climate in this era is not a smooth curve, but a pattern of jolts, oscillations, and regional contrasts. Some warming events occur rapidly. Cold returns can be equally sharp. Local effects vary. One region may open into productive step while another becomes patchier, wetter, or less favourable to the prey base a human group knows best. Scholars still debate how directly these shifts map onto particular episodes of Neanderthal decline or local disappearance. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for what happened across all regions. But the broad outline is difficult to escape. Ancient humans built for one kind of Eurasia increasingly face several Eurasians in succession. For heavily built populations dependent on large animals and close environmental knowledge, this is not a small inconvenience. A warming phase may bring more trees into some areas, fragmenting the open spaces that favour certain prey and certain hunting tactics. A cooling phase may reverse that, but not identically, and not on a timetable convenient for human adaptation. Moisture changes alter plants, which alter herbivores, which alter human movement. Snow conditions alone can determine whether an animal is easy to trap, difficult to follow, or not worth pursuing at all. A strong body remains strong in all of these worlds. But strength cannot by itself restore predictability. It cannot make a herd return to an old route or force a resource patch to persist through a bad sequence of years. This is where the old image of Ice Age life as one endless mammoth hunt becomes dangerously misleading. Ancient humans do not adapt to a single static climate problem. They adapt to moving combinations of cold, aridity, vegetation structure, prey composition, and seasonality. What changes in the late phases of Neanderthal existence is not that difficulty suddenly appears. Difficulty has always been there. What changes is that difficulty becomes more dynamic. The rules keep shifting before cultural and biological systems can fully settle around them. A lineage built for repeated success under one set of recurring conditions may find itself paying more and more to keep up with a world that no longer repeats itself cleanly. One lesser-known consequence of climate instability is demographic, not merely ecological. When habitats become patchier, populations may become patchier too. Groups that once maintained contact across broad regions can become more isolated in ecological refuges, pockets where local conditions remain tolerable while surrounding areas grow hostile or unreliable. Isolation carries costs. Smaller populations are more vulnerable to bad luck, disease, local resource failures, and the gradual erosion of cultural complexity through loss rather than lack of intelligence. Innovations can disappear if the few people carrying them die. Social networks can thin until mate exchange becomes more difficult. Genetic diversity may fall. None of this requires dramatic catastrophe. It can happen quietly, over generations, as distances between viable groups widen and movement becomes riskier or less rewarding. Climate instability also multiplies the burden of the body discussed earlier. A strong, costly body is manageable when large prey remain dependable enough to support it, but unstable ecosystems reduce the confidence with which energy can be budgeted. Hunters may have to travel farther, camps may need to move more often, prey may arrive in poorer condition or in different seasonal windows. Risky hunts may become more frequent precisely when bodies are undernourished. A mild shift in average conditions can therefore trigger a much sharper shift in lived pressure. If the landscape becomes only somewhat less generous, the consequences for a metabolically expensive population may be severe. What was once a narrow but workable margin becomes a repeating deficit. Archaeological signals of this are often subtle. Some regions show fluctuating site density, others suggest contraction into certain favoured zones. Tool traditions persist in some places and seem to thin out in others. Occupation pulses appear and fade. It is tempting to read each local pattern as a simple story of advance and retreat, but prehistory resists that neatness. Different groups may respond differently to the same broad climatic event. Some move, some endure, some disappear from the record, perhaps only to reappear elsewhere. The evidence remains incomplete because preservation is uneven and absences are hard to interpret. Still, taken together, the pattern hints at a world where habitation itself grows more intermittent, more contingent, more exposed to environmental mood. This instability may also alter the social experience of time. In a more predictable world, memory is practical guidance. The place where reindeer crossed last season is likely to matter again. The valley where wood is found, the shelter protected from prevailing wind, the stone source worth the journey, all remain embedded in a repeated rhythm. In an unstable world, memory becomes less trustworthy. The remembered route fails. The old stand of useful trees has changed. The animals arrive later or not at all. Knowledge must become more experimental, and experimentation is expensive when every decision costs calories and risk. Scholars still debate how flexible Neanderthals were under such pressures, and there is good reason to think they were more adaptable than older stereotypes allowed. But adaptability is not infinite, especially in small populations already carrying high energetic demands. There is another cruelty in climate change of this kind. It does not always kill directly. More often it stretches the interval between effort and reward. The hunt takes longer, the camp must move farther, the fuel is wetter, the prey is leaner. Children grow up in a world where adults look more tired. Injuries matter more because replacement labour is harder to spare. None of this announces itself as extinction. It feels instead like mounting friction. A specialist population may survive such friction for centuries, perhaps millennia. But survival under increasing friction is not the same as flourishing. The evolutionary bargain that once made perfect sense begins to return diminishing value. This is also the point where differences in strategy start to matter more than differences in raw ability. A lineage deeply rooted in local ecosystems may outperform others when these ecosystems behave in familiar ways. But if broader social networks, wider diets, longer distance transport, or more flexible technologies begin to offer better insurance against unpredictability, then the balance changes. Not immediately, and not everywhere. Yet climate instability creates the conditions under which alternative human solutions can become comparatively stronger. In that sense, the environment does not simply attack Neanderthals or other robust populations. It changes the scoreboard by altering what counts as advantage. It is important not to overstate the speed of this transformation. Neanderthals do not vanish the moment conditions fluctuate. They have already survived major climatic swings before. Their persistence itself is proof of resilience. The danger lies not in one cold event or one warm event taken alone, but in repeated shifts layered over small population size, high energetic costs, localized social networks, and the arrival of other humans with overlapping needs. No single explanation fully accounts for the outcome, but climate instability is one of the great background forces making all other pressures more dangerous. It does not act alone, yet it makes every challenge harder to absorb. Imagine a group moving through a landscape their grandparents would still recognize, but only partly. The ridge is the same. The cave mouth still faces the same direction, but the animals are less regular, the ground wetter in one season and harder in another. The trees spread differently, the wind carrying unfamiliar scents at the wrong time of year. The adults still know this land, but their knowledge now contains more exceptions, more caution, more failed expectations. They are not lost, but they are no longer entirely at home in the old way. That may be one of the deepest historical meanings of climate instability, not immediate destruction, but the erosion of belonging between a population and the world that shaped it. And once that belonging begins to erode, strength itself changes character. It no longer appears simply as a solution inherited from successful ancestors. It becomes part of a system under strain, one component in a body and land partnership that no longer fits as cleanly as before. The powerful chest still lifts cold air, the hands still grip wood and stone, the legs still carry heavy loads over rough ground. But now the old confidence of repeated return is weakening. The world is moving beneath the feet of the strong, and when the ground begins to shift under a specialist, it does not matter how impressive the specialist once looked in the stability that made him. Into this unstable world comes another kind of human presence, one that is familiar enough to belong to the same family and different enough to alter the balance. Homo sapiens do not arrive in Eurasia as creatures from another planet, nor as inevitable conquerors carrying destiny in their hands. They come as one human population among others, shaped elsewhere under different conditions, carrying their own vulnerabilities, their own local knowledge, their own forms of intelligence and dependence. Yet over time, their arrival matters enormously, not because they are instantly superior at everything, and not because Neanderthals are instantly obsolete, but because they embody a somewhat different solution to the same ancient problem of survival. In a world growing more unstable, even a slight difference in solution can accumulate into history. The contrast begins with the body. Early Homo sapiens are not weak. That point matters, because popular storytelling often replaces one caricature with another, imagining our species as fragile geniuses who somehow think their way past material reality. In truth, the first modern humans entering Eurasia are highly capable physical people living hard lives. They walk long distances, process carcasses, endure cold, raise children under pressure, and survive in difficult landscapes. But their average anatomy tends to be lighter and more elongated than that of Neanderthals. Limbs are often longer, trunks narrower, skeletons less massively built. This does not mean better in every sense. It means different. Their bodies appear to carry lower maintenance costs and perhaps somewhat greater efficiency over distance. In a highly predictable world of close-range confrontations and intense cold specialization, that difference might not decide much. In a patchier world, it may begin to matter. A lighter body changes the arithmetic of daily life in subtle ways. It may cost less to sustain through marginal periods. It may allow longer travel with lower energy expenditure. It may make broader foraging radii more practical when local returns decline. Again, caution is necessary. No single explanation fully accounts for the later spread of Homo sapiens, and anatomy alone cannot explain a continental transition. But when climates fluctuate, prey patterns shift, and populations become more fragmented, even modest metabolic or mobility advantages can compound. A body that is slightly cheaper to maintain buys time. Time allows experimentation, travel, exchange, and recovery after bad sequences. It is not a dramatic advantage at first glance, but prehistory often turns on advantages too small for any one generation to notice clearly. This bodily difference likely travels with broader behavioral patterns. One of the most widely discussed contrasts between later Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens concerns the scale of social networks. Modern humans, even in foraging societies, often sustain exchange relationships across larger areas than earlier models assigned to Neanderthals. Materials move farther, styles spread wider. Information may circulate beyond immediate face-to-face groups more reliably. The archaeological record for the earliest Homo sapiens in Eurasia often suggests longer distance transport of stone, ornament, and perhaps social connection itself. Scholars still debate how sharp this contrast truly is, and Neanderthals were not socially isolated in any absolute sense. Yet what survives in the record suggests that Homo sapiens may have been somewhat better at turning many small groups into broader adaptive webs. In an unstable world, webs matter. That does not mean one population is intelligent and the other is not. It means intelligence may be distributed differently across scale. A Neanderthal group can know its valley with extraordinary depth. A Homo sapiens network may know more valleys at once, less intimately but more collectively. One form of knowledge is not inherently nobler than the other, but when the environment becomes unreliable, breadth can protect where depth alone cannot. If one region fails, contacts elsewhere may provide mates information, techniques, or access to new resources. A bad season becomes less terminal when it can be offset by relationships extending beyond the local landscape. The evidence remains incomplete, yet the general possibility has become increasingly central to how scholars think about the meeting between these populations. Technology may also begin to separate them in accumulating ways. The older picture of Homo sapiens as exclusively ranged hunters, armed with advanced projectiles from the start, is too simple. Technologies vary, innovations appear unevenly, and Neanderthals themselves may have used more complex methods than once assumed. Still, over time, the archaeological record associated with Homo sapiens shows greater diversification in toolkits, more standardized blade production in some traditions, more use of bone and antler in certain contexts, and broader combinations of equipment that may support flexible hunting and processing strategies. Diversity matters because it spreads risk. A population with more ways to solve a problem does not always outperform a specialist, but it is often better buffered against environmental surprise. There is also the matter of symbolism, not as decoration alone, but as social technology. Ornaments, pigments, markings, and other symbolic practices may help maintain identity and connection across larger groups. They can signal belonging, alliance, status, kin ties, or shared ritual frameworks that make cooperation easier beyond the immediate family. Modern humans do not invent meaning, and Neanderthals likely possess symbolic capacities of their own, as earlier sections suggest. But Homo sapiens seem, in many regions, to externalize symbolic life more abundantly and durably. That abundance may have practical consequences. Symbols can hold groups together across distance. They can make strangers more legible to one another. They can preserve social categories beyond memory alone. If so, then art and ornament are not luxuries added after survival is secured. They are part of survival. The arrival of Homo sapiens also introduces competition even when direct conflict is absent. Two human populations exploiting overlapping prey, shelter, raw materials, and migration corridors do not need to wage open war for one to pressure the other. Simple presence is enough. A hunting ground used by one group is not as available to the other. A reliable stone source visited more often may become harder to access. The best valleys, the sheltered caves, the seasonal bottlenecks where animals can be taken efficiently, all become contested in quiet ways. Some of this competition may be invisible archaeologically, leaving only absences and shifts in occupation. Scholars still debate how much violence occurred, and sensational visions of constant war go beyond the evidence. But coexistence under scarcity is never neutral. Even peaceful overlap can change the cost of being human in a landscape. Disease sometimes enters this discussion as well. When previously separated human populations meet, pathogens may move with them. The evidence for specific disease transfer between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens is limited and indirect, so caution is essential. Still, as a general principle, contact between groups can introduce biological pressures as real as climate or competition. No single explanation fully accounts for disappearance, and disease alone is unlikely to solve the puzzle. Yet it may have added friction to populations already under stress. Small groups do not absorb demographic shocks easily. A few deaths in one season can echo for decades when numbers are low and social networks thin. The deepest contrast, however, may lie in flexibility of response. Homo sapiens seem, in many contexts, able to move between ecological strategies with somewhat greater ease. They exploit coastlines more extensively in some regions, incorporate varied prey more readily, build broader exchange systems, and externalize knowledge into objects and practices that travel. None of this happens everywhere at once, and none of it makes them invulnerable. Early modern humans also fail, retreat, and disappear in some settings. History does not move in one smooth, victorious line, but across the larger arc, their package of traits appears especially effective in unstable environments. A lighter body, broader social insurance, more diversified technology, and flexible symbolism together create a human strategy less tied to one narrow ecological bargain. This is where the phrase "a new kind of human" must be handled carefully, biologically. Neanderthals and Homo sapiens are close enough to interbreed, as later sections will explore, which means the gap between them is not absolute. They are different human forms, not alien species in the dramatic sense. Yet their meeting still changes the story because closeness intensifies competition. A lion and a human do not seek exactly the same shelter, the same stone, the same migration corridor. Two human populations often do. Their overlap is intimate, their advantages are comparable, their weaknesses are recognizable. The arrival of Homo sapiens therefore does not merely add another animal to the environment. It adds another planner, another firekeeper, another hunter, another parent, another memory-bearing group trying to solve the same problems. For Neanderthals, this creates a world in which old strengths remain real but no longer stand alone. They are still powerful hunters, they still know their regions with depth, they still endure cold and strain with astonishing capability. But now there are humans nearby who may move farther at lower cost, sustain broader ties, and absorb environmental instability differently. In a stable and abundant landscape, both populations might persist side by side longer, perhaps indefinitely in some zones. In a fragmented, changing world, the margins narrow. The costly body of the strong human must now compete not only with weather and prey, unpredictability, but with another human package that may need less from each day to remain viable. One lesser-known point is that the first contacts may not have been uniformly hostile or even immediately transformative. There may have been periods of limited interaction, local separation, and mutual observation stretched over generations. Small groups do not necessarily understand at once what the other represents. A valley used by strangers one season may simply become a place avoided the next. A distant style of tool may appear before the people who made it are ever seen directly. The frontier between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens is probably more blurred and episodic than older conquest stories allowed, but that very blurring makes the outcome more interesting. Displacement need not be dramatic to be decisive. Quiet replacement can be just as final. Imagine the moment not as battle but as recognition. A Neanderthal hunting party reaches a familiar shelter and finds signs that another human group has been there. Hearth ash, cut bones, tool debris made in a style not quite their own. The animals are the same, the cold is the same, the valley is the same, but the world has changed because there are now other hands reading it, other minds following the same herds, other bodies needing fuel, shelter, and time. That is the real turning point. Not the arrival of a superior being, but the arrival of a competitor shaped by a different balance of costs and possibilities. In a world that no longer reliably rewards heavy specialization, that difference begins to count more with every passing season. What begins to matter now is not brute competition alone, but the shape of adaptation across distance. A human group can survive almost any hardship if hardship remains familiar enough to be prepared for. The deeper threat comes when conditions vary from place to place and from season to season in ways that no single local expertise can fully master. In such a world, survival increasingly depends on the ability to stretch beyond the immediate camp, beyond the remembered valley, beyond the tools and relationships that work only where they were born. This is where networks, range, and strategy begin to alter the story more decisively than raw bodily force. A species does not need to be stronger than its rival if it can solve danger at greater distance, move information faster, and distribute risk across more people and more terrain. Under pressure, indirect advantages become powerful advantages. For Homo sapiens, one of the most consequential strengths may have been social scale. Small human groups are always vulnerable on their own. A hard winter, a few accidents, a disease episode, or the loss of skilled adults can destabilize them quickly. But a group linked to others through regular exchange is not truly alone. It has access not only to mates and materials, but to memory held elsewhere. A distant group may know a different migration route, a different way of shaping a point, a different seasonal resource, a different refuge when one landscape fails. This kind of distributed knowledge becomes an invisible form of resilience. It is difficult to fossilize directly, but it leaves traces in transported materials, recurring styles, ornaments, and the wider geographic coherence of some cultural traditions associated with early modern humans. Scholars still debate exactly how extensive these networks were in different periods and places, yet the broader principle remains compelling. The wider the net, the less likely one local failure is to become fatal. Distance matters in hunting as well. Earlier sections explored the world of close-range pursuit, where strength, nerve, and bodily impact carry enormous weight. By contrast, a toolkit that increasingly allows prey to be wounded, exhausted, or controlled from farther away changes the economics of risk. Projectile weapons are not magic. They still require skill, coordination, and courage. And the archaeological timeline for exactly when different forms become common is complex. But once hunting can be done with even slightly more distance, the body itself no longer has to absorb quite so much of the danger. Fewer injuries, lower mortality, and more reliable returns may follow, even if only gradually. A lighter-bodied human using longer-range tools does not need to overpower the world so directly. He or she can negotiate with it instead. This is an important distinction because negotiation is often cheaper than confrontation. To trap, channel, wound at range, coordinate across positions, or exploit prey behavior without entering the final violent meter changes how much the body must spend for each success. A robust Neanderthal body is well suited to the old bargain of forceful proximity. A Homo sapiens strategy that leans more toward distance and flexibility may spend less muscle to achieve similar or better results. Over one hunt the difference may seem small. Over generations it can become demographic. More adults survive. More children are raised to maturity. More skilled elders remain alive to teach. Fewer losses mean larger networks can persist, and larger networks in turn support more innovation. Strategy feeds population, and population feeds strategy. It is also possible that Homo sapiens manage seasonal movement differently. A more mobile, wide-ranging pattern does not always leave dramatic monuments, but it can create broader ecological insurance. Coastal resources, river corridors, upland patches, woodland edges, and open plains do not all fail in the same way at the same time. A group capable of shifting between them, or maintaining ties across people who do, gains an advantage that is less visible than muscle and more durable under instability. The evidence remains incomplete, and not every modern human population in Ice Age Eurasia behaves identically. But what survives in the record suggests a repeated capacity to combine resources across landscapes rather than relying too heavily on one highly specialized system. In a variable world, combination is power. Symbolic culture may strengthen this further by making larger group identities easier to sustain. Shared ornament styles, pigments, carved objects, repeated motifs, and other symbolic markers are often treated as decorative or spiritual alone, but they may also function as practical tools for cooperation. They can signal who belongs, who can be trusted, who shares obligations, who may exchange mates, information, or shelter. In dense local communities, reputation can be remembered face to face. Across wider territories, symbols help carry social meaning beyond direct familiarity. This is one way intelligence moves outside the skull and into the world. A necklace, a bead, a marked object, or a repeated design may hold not beauty alone, but access to safer relationships. That kind of advantage is difficult to measure and impossible to reduce to a single cause, yet it may be among the quiet forces behind long-term success. Neanderthals almost certainly had relationships beyond the immediate family, and likely beyond the immediate camp. They were not sealed inside isolated bubbles. But if their social worlds were, on average, smaller or less densely connected than those of Homo sapiens, then the difference would matter most in exactly the periods when climate instability and population fragmentation were already increasing danger. A local Neanderthal group could remain highly competent and still find itself more exposed simply because fewer outside ties were available when local competence no longer sufficed. No single explanation fully accounts for this, but demography repeatedly returns as a central issue because human survival is never a property of individuals alone. It is a property of how many minds, bodies, and memories can be linked before crisis arrives. Tool diversity adds another layer. A specialized toolkit can be extraordinarily effective when the problem remains stable. A more varied toolkit may look less elegant in ideal conditions, but it performs better when conditions shift. Blade technologies, bone points, needles or awls in some later contexts, hafting variety, adhesives, and the use of multiple raw materials all suggest ways of buffering against uncertainty. Different tools open different prey, different clothing strategies, different shelter possibilities, different forms of transport and storage. Some of these developments appear gradually and unevenly, and it would be misleading to imagine a sudden explosion of superiority the moment Homo sapiens arrive. Still, the general pattern of broader technical flexibility helps explain how a lighter-bodied species could compete successfully against one so physically formidable. It does not need to outmatch the specialist in his strongest moment. It needs to remain workable across more kinds of moments. One lesser-known but revealing aspect of strategy is time depth in planning. A group with stronger long-distance ties and more diverse technologies may also be better at surviving interruptions because it can spread decisions across time. It can store obligations socially, not only materially. It can postpone total dependence on one valley or one herd because alternatives remain imaginable and reachable. The ancient strong human, by contrast, may excel in the present tense of local mastery. This terrain, this prey, this season, this bodily task, that excellence is real, but if changing conditions increasingly demand planning across larger regions and longer social chains, then the field begins to favour a different style of intelligence. Scholars still debate how strongly this contrast should be drawn, and it must not be turned into stereotype. Yet the archaeological differences in scale, mobility, and exchange suggest that time itself may have been managed differently. This helps clarify why strategy matters more than smarts in the crude modern sense. Both populations are intelligent, both observe, plan, teach, and cooperate. The difference is that one strategy seems more expensive, more local, and more dependent on bodily confrontation, while the other appears more distributed, more buffered, and more capable of solving problems before they become collisions. In an environment of repeated instability, the second strategy can begin to dominate without any need for dramatic superiority in individual encounters. The strong human may still win the hunt, survive the cold, and know the valley better than anyone. But the lighter human may know more valleys, more allies, more fallback options, and more ways to keep a bad season from becoming a dead one. Competition for land and prey would intensify this further, once the best migration bottlenecks, shelter sites, and raw material zones are used by more connected Homo sapiens groups. Neanderthals may be pushed toward less favourable spaces where their costly specialization is even harder to sustain. Such displacement need not happen by direct force. Demographic weight alone can do it. A population with slightly better survival rates, broader exchange, and more flexible resource use will gradually occupy more viable territory and recover faster from losses. The rival population, even if individually formidable, becomes increasingly confined to ecological margins or fragmented refuges. This is one of history's coldest mechanisms, disappearance by compression rather than by spectacle. There is a temptation to cast this as the triumph of intelligence over strength, but that once again oversimplifies the record. What prevails here is not intelligence against strength, but a particular architecture of intelligence distributed through social scale, distance management, symbolic cohesion, and technological flexibility. Strength remains valuable throughout. Homo sapiens themselves depend on it, but strength alone is no longer the core around which survival is built. It becomes one trait among many, rather than the central scaffold of life. The world is moving towards solutions that save energy, reduce bodily risk, and spread uncertainty across networks wider than any single camp. Imagine two groups approaching the same difficult season. One knows the land before it with astonishing precision, reads every contour, moves with practiced force, and can still take large prey when the chance appears. The other knows enough of this land, but also has ties beyond it, more varied tools, and perhaps the habit of moving information and people across greater space. In a good year, the first group may seem stronger in every visible sense. In a bad sequence of years, the second group may simply outlast it. And prehistory, like history, is often decided not by who looks most impressive at the height of stability, but by who keeps enough options alive when stability begins to fail. That is the deeper shift now unfolding in Eurasia. The contest is no longer only between hunter and prey, cold and fire, body and landscape. It is between two human ways of organizing survival. One is muscular, local, intimate, and costly, grounded in direct mastery of a known world. The other is lighter, wider, more strategic across distance, and increasingly better suited to a world that refuses to stay known. Once that difference begins to matter, the old strength of the ancient humans does not vanish at once. It becomes something more painful than useless. It becomes insufficient. There is a moment in many long declines when the trait that once made survival possible begins, almost imperceptibly, to make survival harder. Nothing about the trait itself has changed. The body remains what it was built to be. The skills are still real. The old methods still work often enough to feel trustworthy. And yet the world around them has shifted just enough that the same strength now carries a new cost. This is the turning point at the center of the story. The place where strength over intelligence finally reveals itself as a misleading phrase. The real tragedy is not that ancient humans possessed too much muscle and too little thought. It is that a body and behavior package built for one set of repeated challenges becomes increasingly trapped by its own success when those challenges no longer arrive in familiar form. Strength does not fail because it is primitive. It fails because it is specialized. The body of the robust ancient human, especially the Neanderthal form that dominates much of this discussion, is a masterpiece of commitment. It commits to cold tolerance, to short-range force, to repeated physical labor, to high-return hunting, to a life where muscle and bone carry more of the burden directly. Such a body works brilliantly in environments where local ecological knowledge remains dependable, and where the energetic rewards of dangerous hunting continue to offset the high cost of maintaining such a frame. But in a world of unstable climate, fragmented prey, rising competition, and shifting social scales, commitment becomes rigidity, not immediately and not absolutely, but enough. The same chest that holds heat is costly to feed. The same arm strength that steadies a spear requires a hunting system that still brings large prey within reach. The same compact body that absorbs impact may be less economical when movement must expand across larger territories. Former strengths begin to pull against each other. This is how strength becomes a trap, not by losing its power, but by tying survival to a narrowing set of conditions. A lineage that has become exceptionally good at one difficult form of life may lose comparative ground when life becomes difficult in a different way. It is one thing to dominate a cold plain where herd movement remains legible, and close-range force pays high returns. It is another to navigate a patchwork of shrinking habitats, uncertain seasons, competing human populations, and prey behaviors that no longer align neatly with inherited practice. Under those conditions, a costly specialist can remain impressive and still become vulnerable. The trap lies in being too good at yesterday's problem. There is a biological version of this pattern across evolution. Highly specialized predators, herbivores, and even plants often flourish magnificently within narrow niches, only to decline when those niches fracture. Generalists may look less elegant in stable conditions, but they are often harder to break when environments fluctuate. This comparison must be used carefully, because Neanderthals are not simple animal analogues. They are highly intelligent humans with culture, cooperation, and flexibility of their own, yet the general principle still applies. Cultural intelligence can buffer biological specialization, but it cannot erase it entirely, especially when populations are small and changes fast. No single explanation fully accounts for what happens next. But the pattern of costly excellence under instability is difficult to ignore. The trap is also demographic. Small populations are especially vulnerable to strategies that depend on high adult performance and regular energetic returns. If a group loses a few prime hunters, the effect is not merely emotional, it changes the group's entire metabolic balance. Fewer adults must now sustain the same children, the same elders, the same injured. Knowledge may be lost with the dead. Hunting competence may fall. Reproduction may slow. A body type that depends on robust adult contribution becomes harder to reproduce socially when adult numbers thin. By contrast, populations with broader networks and lower per-body costs may recover more quickly from losses. This is where the trap closes quietly. Strength demands continuity, but continuity becomes exactly what unstable environments and intense competition undermine. Hunting itself may begin to illustrate the problem with particular clarity. Close-range methods are not useless simply because Homo sapiens are present, or because climate shifts. They may still produce kills, sometimes spectacularly, but if prey becomes more dispersed, more nervous, or more difficult to predict, and if safer or more varied technologies are increasingly available to others, then the old methods demand more from the body for less certainty of return. A risky encounter that once made sense because success was frequent may start to look expensive in a world where injuries are harder to absorb and replacements fewer. The stronger body is still built for impact, but the ecological reward for impact has thinned. The trap is not that the hunters forget how to hunt. It is that their expertise no longer yields the same security. One lesser-known dimension of this problem concerns cultural conservatism, which must not be misunderstood as stupidity. All successful systems become conservative to some degree because success validates tradition. If a tool type, hunting tactic, seasonal movement, or settlement pattern has worked for generations, there is good reason to trust it. Innovation carries risk. In harsh environments, risk can kill. Neanderthal populations may therefore have had rational reasons to preserve proven methods. Scholars still debate how innovative or conservative they truly were in different regions, and there is growing evidence that they were more adaptable than older models claimed. Yet even a moderately conservative bias can become costly when the world begins changing faster than inherited solutions can keep pace. What worked because it had always worked becomes the thing most difficult to abandon. The social world may amplify the trap further. If Neanderthal groups were generally smaller and more locally rooted than incoming Homo sapiens networks, then experimentation itself would be harder to spread and preserve. A new technique discovered by one group might disappear with them. A slight improvement in projectile use, clothing construction, food storage, or seasonal routing might remain local and fragile rather than becoming shared cultural capital across wide territory. Intelligence remains present, creativity remains possible, but the architecture for cumulative adaptation is weaker. In such conditions, even when Neanderthals innovate, their innovations may not travel far enough or survive long enough to change the larger trajectory. That is one of prehistory's cruelest realities. Solutions can exist and still fail to scale. There is a temptation here to imagine a clean divide, with Neanderthals locked into old ways while Homo sapiens flow effortlessly into new ones. The evidence does not support anything so simple. There are signs of behavioral flexibility among Neanderthals, including varied diets, possible symbolic behavior, material ingenuity, and regional adaptation. Likewise, Homo sapiens are not endlessly adaptive in every context. Some of their populations fail too. Some disappear. Some retreat. The difference is not absolute flexibility versus absolute rigidity. It is relative flexibility under compounded stress. The trap closes not because one species lacks imagination, but because the whole package of body, demography, social scale, and environmental pressure makes adaptation more expensive for one than for the other. And still, from inside Neanderthal life, none of this would have looked like a trap at first. The daily tasks remain the same. Fire must be kept, children fed, meat carried, tools maintained, shelter chosen. The body still does what it has always done. It lifts, grips, runs, absorbs cold, survives impact. In fact, the trap may feel most invisible precisely because the body remains so competent. Success still happens. Hunts still succeed. Winters are still endured. That intermittent success can mask long-term decline, much as a few good harvests can hide a failing agricultural system. A lineage can be losing the future while still winning many days in the present. What turns competence into vulnerability is the shrinking margin for error. An injury that once healed within a socially supported group now removes too much labour. A bad season once offset by local abundance now arrives, after several unstable years. A valley once occupied alone is now shared or lost. A child once raised into a strong adult now grows up in a smaller, more fragmented population, with fewer ties outward. Every old strength still functions, but each now depends on conditions that are harder to guarantee. The trap, then, is really a loss of tolerance. The system has become less forgiving without the participants fully perceiving how much. This may be why the disappearance of Neanderthals does not look like sudden collapse everywhere. In some places, it likely unfolds as thinning, contraction, local persistence, retreat into refuges, and uneven coexistence before final absorption or loss. A trap rarely slams shut all at once at continental scale. It tightens region by region. One group vanishes here, another survives there for centuries longer, another interbreeds, another leaves behind a final occupation layer and then silence. Scholars still debate the chronology of different regions, and the evidence remains incomplete. But the broad emotional shape of the process is clear enough. It is not the end of a monstrous failure. It is the narrowing of a once successful human way of life until success itself can no longer sustain it. There is also a philosophical discomfort in this story, which may be one reason the old stereotype survived for so long. Modern people prefer decline to feel deserved. We like to imagine that those who disappear lacked some important trait we possess. But Neanderthals do not offer that comfort. They are strong, intelligent, social, inventive, and deeply human. Their problem is not inferiority in any simple sense. Their problem is that evolution fitted them magnificently to a world that began to move away from them. That is far more unsettling, because it suggests that being excellent is no guarantee of endurance if excellence is too tightly bound to a vanishing set of conditions. Imagine a final successful hunt by a small Neanderthal group somewhere in Western Eurasia. The kill is made, the meat is cut, the fire burns, children eat. The adults look no different from their ancestors in the same place thousands of years before. Their bodies are still extraordinary, their knowledge is still precise, their courage is still enough, and yet the wider system surrounding that success has already changed beyond recovery. There are fewer neighbouring groups like them. Other humans move through nearby valleys. The climate no longer keeps the same promises. The old strengths still work, but only locally, only temporarily, only against odds that grow less favourable with every generation. That is what it means for strength to become a trap. Not that it was the wrong answer, but that it remained the right answer for too long in a world that had stopped asking the same question. By this point in the story, the landscape itself begins to feel like evidence. Not only the caves and valleys where people once lived, but the bones left in their floors, the teeth worn by years of use, the broken shafts, the cut-marked limbs of prey, the blackened circles where hearths once held heat against the cold. Archaeology rarely gives us a single dramatic answer. It gives us residues, scattered clues, and stubborn fragments that refuse to say more than they can support. Yet when enough of those fragments are assembled, a picture starts to emerge of daily life lived under strain, competence, and repeated physical demand. If the earlier sections describe how strength may have become a trap, the bones and sites themselves show how that strength was actually lived. They preserve not theory, but consequences. The skeleton is the first archive. Neanderthal bones are often thick, with powerful muscle attachment areas, large joints, and the unmistakable architecture of a body accustomed to force. But what matters as much as their general form is the damage they carry. Many individuals show signs of healed trauma. Ribs have been broken and rejoined. Limbs have fractured and endured. There are cranial injuries, degenerative changes in joints, stress traces in shoulders, elbows, and knees, and where patterns consistent with repeated demanding labour. None of this proves a single cause. Some injuries may come from hunting, others from falls, accidents, interpersonal violence, or the ordinary brutality of moving through dangerous terrain. Scholars still debate how precisely to interpret individual patterns, but taken together, the evidence remains remarkably consistent. These are people whose bodies absorb a level of punishment that matches the close, forceful world described earlier. One of the more revealing details is that many of these injuries heal. That fact matters almost more than the injuries themselves. A badly hurt hunter surviving long enough for bone to remodel is direct evidence that others kept him alive. Food must have been shared. Shelter must have been maintained. The injured must have been protected during periods when they could not fully contribute. This tells us something essential about the social reality hidden inside the robust body. It is easy to admire Neanderthal strength as an individual quality, but the bones insist on a collective truth. These powerful humans survive not only because they are strong, but because strength exists inside communities willing to carry weakness when it appears. Even in the hardest environments, their society is not a machine that discards damaged parts. Teeth provide a second archive, smaller and often more intimate. Dental wear in Neanderthals can be extreme. In some individuals, the front teeth are worn in ways suggesting repeated use as a kind of third hand, gripping hides, fibres, or other materials during processing tasks. Microscopic scratches and broader wear patterns hint at behaviour that combines technical skill with bodily force. The mouth becomes part of the toolkit. This is one of those lesser-known details that makes ancient life feel unexpectedly immediate. We tend to imagine intelligence residing in the brain and tools residing in the hand. Yet in these populations, practical life recruits the entire body into labour. Teeth, shoulders, wrists, spine, and knees all participate in survival. The body is not just the bearer of intelligence. It is one of its main working surfaces. Then there are the animal bones, perhaps the clearest witnesses of all. At many sites associated with Neanderthals, the remains of large herbivores carry cut marks, percussion damage from marrow extraction, patterned disarticulation, and selective transport decisions. Certain parts of carcasses appear more often than others, suggesting choices about which limbs or tissues are worth bringing back to a shelter. In some cases, the age and seasonality of animals provide hints about hunting timing and local ecological knowledge. These traces are not random. They record a practiced economy of flesh. A carcass is not merely opened, it is processed according to habit, need, weight, and future use. What survives in the record suggests people who know precisely where nutrition lies and how to access it efficiently under pressure. The distribution of tools around these remains can be just as revealing. Stone flakes are not scattered without meaning. Activity areas form. Some spaces are used for butchery, others for tool production, others for fire, sleeping, or repeated occupation. In caves and shelters, layers of ash, bone, and stone create an almost rhythmic pattern of return. These are not people drifting without structure through empty wilderness. They organize space. They come back. They use places with memory. Some localities appear to have served as seasonal stop points, temporary hunting stands, or repeatedly favoured shelters in landscapes mapped not on paper, but in habit and inherited knowledge. The record is never complete enough to reconstruct every camp with confidence, but the cumulative pattern speaks of order rather than improvisation. Isotopic analysis adds another layer, though it must be read with care. Chemical traces preserved in bones and teeth can indicate something about long-term diet and trophic level. Many Neanderthals appear to derive a large portion of their protein from animal sources, particularly in colder regions, reinforcing the image of populations heavily reliant on hunting large game. Yet this does not erase evidence for plant use or regional variability. Some sites preserve plant residues in dental calculus, and other remains suggest more diverse diets than the older all-meat stereotype allowed. No single explanation fully accounts for dietary behavior across all Neanderthal populations. Still, the broad picture remains one of people whose bodies and lifeways are strongly tied to high-return foraging. The bones do not tell us that they are incapable of flexibility. They tell us that flexibility often unfolds inside a system still anchored by demanding nutritional needs. The tools themselves speak with a quieter voice. Mousterian toolkits and related traditions vary, but they often show repeated, deliberate strategies for preparing cores, striking flakes, retouching edges, and maintaining useful forms across different tasks. This is not haphazard stone breaking. It reflects learned sequences, choices about raw material, and expectations about future use. Some sites also preserve evidence of hafting and adhesives, further complicating any simplistic picture of brute force hunters relying only on crude handheld implements. The strength of the body is present in these assemblages, but so is planning. A spear point prepared in advance, a cutting edge retouched after butchery, an adhesive process managed under controlled heating conditions, all point toward cognition embedded in routine. There is something deeply persuasive in the wear traces on tools and bones taken together. They show repeated motions, scraping hides, cutting meat, carving wood, retouching edges, carrying loads, opening joints, breaking long bones, tending fires, processing resources until raw matter becomes usable life. When archaeologists analyze microscopic damage on stone edges, they can sometimes infer whether a tool worked wood, hide, meat, or plant material. These tiny traces matter because they restore texture to a life often flattened into hunting scenes alone. Strength in Neanderthal existence is not only the dramatic strength of the kill, it is the sustained strength of work after the kill, before the kill, and during all the ordinary hours when no prey is visible at all. The sites of repeated occupation also reveal something about the tension between local mastery and vulnerability. Certain caves and shelters are used over long spans, which suggest reliable knowledge of productive places. Yet repeated return can also imply dependence. A favourable shelter near good hunting ground is an asset. But if prey patterns shift or competing groups begin to use the same corridor, the whole system feels the loss sharply. Archaeology cannot always tell us exactly when a favoured place stops working or why. Some occupations end because of changing climate, some because of sediment or preservation bias, some perhaps because people move elsewhere. Scholars still debate the meaning of many local sequences, but the emotional pattern remains powerful. The same sites that testify to mastery also expose how closely life may have been tied to particular landscapes. One especially important category of evidence comes from individuals who look as though they lived hard and died hard, but not alone. A body with multiple healed injuries, worn teeth, degenerative joints, and signs of long-term strain suggests years of participation in physically punishing work. It also suggests a society capable of carrying memory through damaged bodies. Elders matter here. If experienced individuals survive long enough to continue teaching after their physical peak, then the group gains continuity that no artifact count alone can measure. This makes later decline even more poignant. A shrinking or fragmented population does not merely lose numbers, it loses embodied archives, people whose bones, scars, habits, and judgments hold solutions the landscape once rewarded. All of this evidence pushes against the old insult in the same direction. The bones do not describe brutes, they describe specialists living near the edge of what a human body can do in severe conditions. They show intelligence present everywhere, though not always in the forms modern observers find easiest to admire. They also show cost, the injuries, the heavy workloads, the dietary reliance, the repeated physical strain, the probable dependence on specific prey and places, all point to a human system with enormous capability and limited slack. That limited slack is the key. A robust body can survive astonishing hardship, but it must continue receiving enough from the world to justify its expense. Once the world becomes patchier and competition grows, the very evidence of strength begins to read as evidence of exposure. Imagine an excavation trench cut through the floor of an old shelter. Layer by layer, the sediment opens, ash lenses, shattered bone, stone flakes, an animal tooth, a hearth stain, a broken point, perhaps a human fragment worn smooth by time. Nothing announces a grand theory. Yet each object is the residue of choice, labour, danger, and adaptation. Someone sat here cutting meat. Someone gripped a hide between the teeth while working it with stone. Someone limped on a healed leg and still survived another winter. Someone fed a child from the remains of a successful hunt. Someone knew exactly where the herd would pass, until one year it did not. This is what the bones still reveal. Not a species that traded intelligence for strength, but a people whose intelligence lived through strength so completely that when strength became costly, the whole world they had built around it began to narrow with them. By the time the evidence accumulates into a broad pattern, Certainty has already begun to dissolve. That is one of the frustrating truths of prehistory. The closer a question comes to mattering most, the less likely the surviving record is to answer it cleanly. Neanderthals disappear as a distinct human population. Yet the reasons for that disappearance remain among the most argued topics in paleoanthropology. Climate change, competition with Homo sapiens, demographic fragility, disease, cultural differences, technological gaps, interbreeding, and plain bad luck have all been proposed, refined, challenged, or combined in different ways. The debate has lasted so long because each explanation captures something real and yet fails, on its own, to explain enough. No single explanation fully accounts for this ending. The more carefully the evidence is handled, the less satisfying any simple answer becomes. Older accounts often preferred a dramatic winner and loser story. Neanderthals were outcompeted by smarter modern humans. The strong but dim old branch gave way to the clever future. It is tidy, memorable, and deeply misleading. Archaeology no longer supports such a crude contrast. Neanderthals are now widely understood to have been socially complex, technically capable, and behaviorally flexible within important limits. Their disappearance cannot be reduced to mental inferiority. At the same time, the correction should not swing so far that all differences vanish into politeness. Something did separate the long-term trajectories of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. The debate is not whether a difference existed, but what kind of difference mattered most, and under what conditions it became decisive. Climate remains one of the strongest candidates, though not in the simple sense of cold killing off cold adapted people. That would make little sense for a population that had already endured severe environments for hundreds of thousands of years. The climate argument is subtler. It focuses on instability, fragmentation, and the repeated reorganization of habitats and prey. In this view, Neanderthals do not fail because they are weak in bad weather. They fail because repeated environmental shifts erode the ecological predictability their costly specialization depends on. Some regions become patchier, some prey bases change, population refuges shrink or become disconnected. A lineage built around intense local mastery and high energetic demands begins to lose the stable landscape logic that once made its strengths pay off. The evidence for climatic volatility is strong. The challenge is showing exactly how and when that volatility maps onto local disappearance. Scholars still debate those links because chronology is imperfect and regional stories vary. Competition with Homo sapiens is the other great pillar of explanation, and here too the debate has become more nuanced over time. The strongest versions of this argument do not require dramatic warfare or open extermination. Competition can be quiet. Two human populations using overlapping resources do not need to kill each other constantly for one to displace the other. If Homo sapiens maintain somewhat broader social networks, lower metabolic costs, more flexible foraging strategies, or better demographic recovery, then they can gradually occupy more viable territory and rebound faster from losses. Neanderthals, even while remaining effective locally, may find themselves compressed into less favourable zones or thinner populations. This explanation fits the archaeological pattern in many places, yet it also raises questions. Coexistence appears to have lasted for significant periods in some regions. Interbreeding occurred, cultural boundaries may have been blurred at times, so competition matters, but not in the simplistic form of instant replacement by superior invaders. Demography may be the quietest and perhaps most powerful explanation of all. Small populations are fragile even when individually competent. They lose innovations more easily, suffer more from bad seasons, and face greater risks from local disasters, inbreeding, and random fluctuations in birth and death. A few lost adults can change everything in a small foraging group. If Neanderthals were often distributed in lower densities and more fragmented populations than Homo sapiens, then their margin for absorbing stress was already narrow before any additional challenge arrived. Climate instability and competition would then act not as independent killers, but as forces magnified by low numbers. This is one reason many researchers increasingly favour multi-causal models. A small, scattered population can survive a harsh climate. It can survive competitors. It can survive periodic losses. What it may fail to survive is all of them layered together across enough generations. Disease is sometimes invoked as a hidden accelerator. The idea is plausible in principle. When previously separated human groups come into contact, pathogens may cross between them. A population with lower numbers and more limited connectivity may be more exposed to serious demographic consequences from outbreaks. But the direct evidence remains thin. We do not have a simple paleopathological record of one disease sweeping through Neanderthal groups in the final phase of their existence. Genetic clues and general epidemiological logic make disease worth considering, but not as a standalone solution. It belongs more comfortably among amplifying pressures than primary causes. The evidence remains incomplete, and here more than anywhere caution is necessary. Then there is the question of technology. Did Homo sapiens possess tools so clearly superior that Neanderthals could not keep up? The answer appears to be both yes and no, depending on how narrowly the question is framed. There is no single invention that neatly explains the whole transition. Neanderthals had hafted tools, skilled stoneworking traditions, control of fire, and sophisticated hunting competence. Yet over time, Homo sapiens seemed to display broader technological diversity. More extensive use of symbolic materials, more varied raw material transport, and in some contexts more distance-based hunting systems. These differences may not look decisive in one season or one valley. Over millennia, however, they may have offered better insurance against instability. Technology in this debate matters less as isolated gadgets than as part of a wider adaptive package. Cultural transmission is closely tied to that package. A population can produce good ideas and still fail if those ideas do not spread or persist. If Homo sapiens sustained wider networks, then innovations could move farther and survive local losses more easily. A successful clothing technique, hunting strategy, or social practice could become cumulative rather than temporary. Neanderthals may also have innovated, and likely did, but smaller. Thinner networks make cumulative culture harder to maintain. This does not imply lesser intelligence. It implies fewer pathways for intelligence to scale. What survives in the record suggests that one human population may have been better positioned to turn local solutions into regional resilience. Interbreeding complicates everything. For many years, disappearance was imagined as total replacement, one species gone, the other remaining. Genetics changed that picture. Neanderthals did not simply vanish without trace. They contributed DNA to later human populations, especially outside Africa. That fact forces a different understanding of their ending. In some cases, encounter led not to exclusion but to mixture. This does not erase disappearance, because Neanderthals still cease to exist as a distinct population, but it means that part of their story is assimilation rather than annihilation. Scholars still debate how much interbreeding occurred in different places and times, and how socially integrated those contacts were. Even so, The presence of Neanderthal ancestry in later humans is one of the clearest signs that the border between populations was human, not absolute. There are also debates over timing. Different regions show different last appearances for Neanderthal-associated occupations, and these dates have often shifted as new methods and new discoveries emerge. Some previously late dates have been challenged or revised. Some refugial areas, especially in parts of Western Europe, seem to have held on longer than others. This matters because a staggered, regionally uneven disappearance supports the idea of local processes rather than one simple continental event. In one place, competition may dominate. In another, climate fragmentation may matter more. In another, interbreeding and absorption may play a larger role. The temptation to identify a single final blow remains strong, but prehistory more often offers us an accumulation of pressures that look different depending on where one stands. One lesser known but important debate concerns whether Neanderthals were already declining before major contact with Homo sapiens in some regions. If so, then modern humans may have entered a landscape where Neanderthal populations were already under demographic and ecological stress. That would make competition significant, but as a pressure imposed on an already weakened system rather than on a fully stable one. Some evidence points in that direction, though interpretation remains contested. This kind of debate matters because it changes the moral tone of the story. It is not a tale of a flourishing, strong human suddenly defeated by a superior newcomer, but of a resilient population carrying long-term stress when a new competitor arrives at exactly the wrong time. The most convincing picture, then, is not elegant. It is layered. Neanderthals likely face recurring climate instability that fragments habitats and prey patterns. Their populations, often small and dispersed, become more vulnerable to bad luck and loss of cultural continuity. Homo sapiens arrive with somewhat different bodies, broader social networks, more flexible technologies, and greater capacity to distribute risk across distance. Competition intensifies, not always violently, but persistently. Disease may add friction. Interbreeding blurs the boundary in some cases while erasing it in others. The result is not a single dramatic extinction event, but a drawn-out narrowing of a human form until it no longer persists separately. There is something unsatisfying in this, especially for minds trained to want neat endings. We want the one cause, the decisive innovation, the final mistake. But history is often truer when it resists those desires. The disappearance of Neanderthals seems to have been the outcome of overlapping vulnerabilities rather than one fatal flaw. Their strength was real. Their intelligence was real. Their humanity was real. The world around them changed, and other humans entered that changing world with a somewhat different set of advantages. Under those conditions, excellence in one ecological mode may simply have been too narrow to hold. Imagine the archaeologist and the geneticist, decades apart in method but united in frustration, both staring at the same question from different kinds of evidence. One sees bones, layers, hearths, gaps in occupation. The other sees inherited fragments of DNA surviving in people who have never heard the names of the vanished. Neither line of evidence offers a perfect answer. Together they suggest something more haunting, not a clean defeat, but a thinning, a long human fading shaped by climate, competition, demography, and contact, until one day the distinct Neanderthal world is no longer there, not because it lacked value, but because no system, however strong, survives unchanged when enough pressures converge at once. The stereotype lingers because it is simple. It gives modern people a flattering ancestor story in which progress moves in a straight line. Intelligence rises like light, and everything heavy, local, and physically demanding belongs to a lower stage now safely behind us. In that story, Neanderthals become a kind of warning label attached to the wrong version of being human, too strong, too direct, too tied to the body, too limited to survive. But the farther the evidence advances, the harder that story is to maintain. What emerges instead is not a failed human experiment, but a specialist population of astonishing competence, adapted with rare precision to a world that later humans inherited only briefly and often badly understood. They are not brutes who happen to persist. They are masters of a difficult ecological style, and their disappearance says less about stupidity than about the fragility of specialization when conditions begin to change too quickly. To call them specialists is not to diminish them. It is to place them inside a deeper logic of evolution and history. Specialists often look extraordinary precisely because they are so well shaped to the demands that formed them. A high-altitude animal, a deep-sea predator, a desert plant. Each can appear almost over-designed for its environment. The same is true of Neanderthals and other robust ancient humans in cold and variable Eurasian settings. Their bodies are not generalized compromises. They are tuned instruments, short, powerful limbs conserve heat and generate force. Broad trunks support energetic life in harsh climates. Strong hands and shoulders suit close-range control and heavy processing work. Their likely social structures, their knowledge of terrain, their use of fire, their hunting systems, their seasonal rhythms, all appear fitted to a world where survival comes from deep local mastery rather than broad abstraction. This is not primitive, it is precise. The word precise matters because one of the old distortions in popular imagination is to assume that any human population leaving fewer obvious symbolic monuments must therefore have lived in a rougher, less thoughtful haze. But specialization often reduces visible waste. It strips practice down to what works repeatedly under pressure. A hunter who knows exactly where a herd narrows into a pass does not need ceremony to justify that knowledge. A group that can read snow crust, wind direction, animal movement, and the shelter value of a ridge is performing a level of environmental interpretation that many modern observers could not reproduce for a single day. Much of that intelligence vanishes archaeologically because it was stored in bodies, habits, and shared memory rather than in large durable objects. The silence of the record, in other words, is not always silence of mind. Sometimes it is the quiet of competence. This is one reason Neanderthals seem to modern researchers increasingly less like a lesser humanity and more like an alternative humanity. They are not us, only rougher. They are another successful answer to Pleistocene life. Their success lasted an immense span of time, far longer than many later civilizations that like to imagine themselves superior. For hundreds of thousands of years they survive climatic swings, dangerous prey, chronic injury, small group living, and landscapes that would defeat most modern people within days. Their disappearance at the end of that long tenure should not blind us to the scale of what they had already accomplished. A lineage that endures across such time is not clumsy. It is profoundly effective. One lesser-known correction to the stereotype comes from the simple variability within Neanderthal life. Popular imagery tends to compress them into one expression, one posture, one eternal scene of grunting violence in the snow. The real record is far less uniform. Different regions show different prey emphasis, different tool choices, different local ecologies, and likely different rhythms of movement. Some groups live in more wooded settings, some in more open ones. Some exploit large herbivores heavily, others appear to use a wider range of foods. Some occupations suggest repeated cave use, others open-air mobility. This variation matters because it reminds us that even specialists are not mechanically identical. Neanderthal specialization is broad enough to include local adaptation and behavioral range. They are not frozen in a single mode. They are living human populations responding to different versions of the same hard continent. Even their supposed lack of imagination has been steadily eroded by new evidence and better interpretation. Adhesives, possible body ornamentation, use of pigments, careful treatment of certain dead, structured occupation spaces, and perhaps the selective use of feathers or claws all point toward minds that are neither symbolically empty nor technically crude. None of this proves that Neanderthal culture looked like Upper Paleolithic Homo sapiens culture, and it should not be forced into that mould. Their symbolism, if less abundant or less archaeologically durable, may simply have taken different forms or social weight. Scholars still debate how common such behaviours were, and caution remains necessary. But the stereotype of the mindless strongman has lost its foundation. What survives in the record suggests people capable of meaning as well as utility, even if their meanings were not preserved in the same volume or style as those of later humans. The specialist view also explains why their strength can be both admirable and historically dangerous. Specialists are often unbeatable on familiar ground. A Neanderthal group in a known valley, with known prey, known shelter, and inherited seasonal understanding, may have been extraordinarily difficult to outmatch. They do not need to be more inventive every day because their world, when legible, is already being read at great depth. This may be why the old body plan persists so long. It keeps working. The trap only appears later, when familiar ground becomes less familiar, and when another human strategy enters the same spaces carrying different advantages. The specialist is not worse at the original task. The task itself is being replaced by a more unstable set of demands. There is also a tendency to judge specialists by what they did not become. Neanderthals did not build states, write epics, or generate the visible cultural explosion associated with later modern humans. But this retrospective judgment is unfair because it treats history as a race toward outcomes no one in the Pleistocene could have known or intended. The question is not why Neanderthals failed to become us. The question is how they became so effective at being themselves. Once framed that way, the evidence looks different. Their culture is not a rough draft of ours. It is an accomplished local form of humanity with its own architecture of body, skill, and social dependence. Their extinction or absorption is a historical event, not a verdict on their worth. The bones help reinforce this reappraisal. Thick cortical structure, strong muscle markings, repeated trauma, worn teeth used in labour, all of these once fed the brute image. Now they read more like the marks of specialization under punishing conditions. A body that survives close-range hunting and relentless physical work will look used. A life shaped by direct contact with material reality will leave harder traces than one buffered by later technologies. This does not make it less intelligent. It makes it more visibly burdened by the costs of survival. The same evidence that once encouraged contempt now encourages respect, because researchers have learned to read strain not as crudity, but as price. Social care is another part of that price, and perhaps the most humanizing of all. Injured individuals who survive, elders who endure past their physical peak, the probable teaching necessary to sustain local knowledge, all point towards societies that value continuity and mutual dependence. A specialist society especially needs memory held in people. The one who knows where to find stone in a bad year, which ravine shelters from the wrong wind. When the animals alter their route after unusual thaw, becomes invaluable. Such knowledge is not easily replaced. If small populations lose these people, their competence narrows fast. This is one reason Neanderthal life may have looked so resilient, and yet proved so fragile under compounded stress. Specialists require continuity not only of environment, but of transmission. The old insult also overlooks how much of human intelligence everywhere is embodied rather than abstract. Even in the modern world, countless expert skills cannot be fully written down. A carpenter's hand pressure, a herder's reading of animal mood, a diver's response to current, a surgeon's sense of tissue. Much of expertise lives in action before it lives in explanation. Among Neanderthals, whose survival is so deeply tied to direct physical engagement with land, prey, fire, hide, and stone, embodied intelligence would have been even more central. To mistake that for lesser intelligence is to confuse literacy of the body with absence of thought. In truth, their world may have demanded an exceptionally high level of sensory and practical intelligence simply to sustain ordinary life. This is why the contrast with Homo sapiens should be handled carefully. The more useful distinction is not smart versus strong, but different specialists in different kinds of flexibility. Homo sapiens eventually seem better at scaling networks, externalizing culture, and distributing risk across distance. Neanderthals seem better read as masters of dense local adaptation, bodily resilience, and intimate environmental skill. Both are intelligent, both are human. One package becomes more future-proof under late Pleistocene instability. The other remains magnificent but increasingly exposed. That outcome does not make the second package primitive. It makes it precarious. A good way to understand this is to imagine how each would appear in its stronger setting. A Neanderthal group moving through familiar winter terrain, reading the snow and wind as if they were text, handling prey at close range with practiced force, maintaining fire and shelter with disciplined efficiency, would not look like a lesser people. They would look formidable. They would look like what they were one of the most physically competent human populations ever to exist, made for conditions that most later humans encounter only in fragments. Their problem is not that they are unsuited to life, it is that life does not remain suited to them. Scholars still debate exactly how broad Neanderthal flexibility really was, and how much their populations could change behavior under worsening conditions. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanatory model captures every region equally well. But the larger interpretive shift is now hard to reverse. The brute is gone. In his place stands a specialist whose strengths were once so well matched to the world that they endured for ages, his disappearance. And the disappearance of his people as a distinct form is therefore more poignant than the old myths allowed. It is not the deserved end of dull force. It is the fading of a human expertise tied too closely to a world already beginning to disappear. Imagine the last time one of these groups enters a favoured shelter after a successful hunt. The work unfolds with no confusion. Tools are used in the right order. Fire is placed correctly. Meat is divided according to knowledge older than anyone present. A child watches and learns the gestures that once kept generations alive. Nothing here is brutish. Nothing here is accidental. This is a refined survival tradition operating at full clarity, and that may be the saddest part of all. The people in that shelter have not become foolish. They have not forgotten how to live. They are still specialists of the highest order. But the world outside the firelight is changing toward a form in which being exactly this good at exactly this life is no longer enough. Disappearance is rarely as complete as it looks from a distance. The archaeological record often gives the impression of ending through silence, a final layer in a cave. a last cluster of tools in a valley, a skeleton type that no longer appears in the same form. But genetics has made silence less absolute. It has shown that Neanderthals and other archaic humans in different regions did not simply pass out of existence as though a door had closed behind them. They met Homo sapiens not only in competition, but in intimacy. They interbred. They left pieces of themselves in later populations. The strong ancient humans did not remain whole, but neither were they wholly erased. Part of their story survives not in monuments or unbroken cultural lineages, but in the bodies of the descendants who replaced them. That realization changes the emotional shape of the ending. For a long time, extinction was imagined as clean replacement. One kind of human ends, another continues. The modern world, in that view, is the victor's inheritance alone. Genetic evidence shattered that neat division. Most people with ancestry outside Africa carry a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA, and some populations in parts of Asia and Oceania also carry ancestry from other archaic humans, such as Denisovans. The exact percentages vary, and the history behind them is complex, involving multiple encounters and deep population structure. Scholars still debate the number, timing, and social context of these episodes. But the larger conclusion is secure. Ancient human worlds overlapped not only in territory, but in reproduction. They were different enough to remain distinct populations for long periods, yet close enough to produce fertile descendants. That is not a border between humanity and non-humanity. It is a border within humanity itself. This matters because it forces us to rethink what it means to disappear. Neanderthals ceased to exist as a separate people, with their own recurring body form, local traditions, and independent demographic future. In that sense, they do disappear, but some of their genes do not. They move into the expanding populations of Homo sapiens and continue forward in altered form. Extinction becomes partly absorption. Loss becomes partly blending. The ancient strong humans are no longer visible as themselves, yet fragments of their biological inheritance remain woven into later human life. This is not a sentimental rescue of the past. It does not undo the extinction of a distinct lineage. Still, it softens the old image of total replacement and makes the story more complicated, more intimate, and more haunting. One of the most surprising aspects of this genetic legacy is that it is not random noise. Some inherited Neanderthal variants appear to have affected traits related to immunity, skin biology, and other adaptations that may have mattered as modern humans moved into new environments outside Africa. Not every inherited fragment proved useful. Some may have been neutral, others harmful enough to be gradually reduced by natural selection over time. The genome is not a museum displaying all ancient contributions equally. It is a battlefield of retention and removal. Yet the fact that some Neanderthal-derived DNA persisted suggests that parts of their evolutionary history remained valuable inside later human populations, in a strange way. This means that the ancient humans who seemed overly specialized for vanished worlds still passed on solutions that mattered in the future. There is irony in that. A lineage whose body plan became too costly, too local, or too narrowly fitted to endure as a separate population may still contribute traits that help another population survive. The specialist disappears, but pieces of the specialist's hard-won adaptation live on in a more flexible host. History often works like this. It does not preserve entire ways of life. It salvages fragments, strips them from their original setting, and lets them function under new conditions. What survives in us, then, is not Neanderthal life as they knew it. It is residue, useful in some cases, burdensome in others, always incomplete. Still, residue matters. It means the strong humans did not simply vanish into nothing. The Denisovan parallel, though more shadowy, widens this picture. Denisovans are known from even fewer direct fossils than Neanderthals. Yet genetics reveals that they too contributed ancestry to later human populations, especially in parts of Asia and Oceania. Some Denisovan-derived variants appear to have played roles in high-altitude adaptation among Tibetans, which is one of the most striking examples of archaic inheritance shaping recent human biology. This broader pattern suggests that interbreeding was not an odd accident on the margins of prehistory. It may have been a recurrent feature of encounters between expanding Homo sapiens and the human populations already present in Eurasia. The human past is not a clean series of replacements. It is braided, with some branches ending as branches but not before leaving fibers inside the rope. That braid complicates the moral language we attach to prehistory. If Neanderthals contributed to us, then the old story of clever humans triumphing over brutish non-humans becomes even less tenable. We did not simply overcome them. In part, we became them. Or rather, we carried part of them onward. Their extinction was not only external defeat, it was also partial incorporation into the populations that ultimately dominated. Scholars still debate how much interbreeding occurred and whether it was concentrated in a few episodes or spread across many contacts. The evidence remains incomplete, especially when trying to reconstruct the social reality behind the genes. Were these rare encounters sustained borderland mixtures, moments of exchange within coexistence zones? No single explanation fully accounts for the pattern. But whatever the answer, it requires us to imagine these ancient humans not only as rivals, but as potential kin. This does not mean coexistence was peaceful or equal. Interbreeding in human history can occur under many social conditions, including coercive ones. Genetics cannot tell us whether these encounters were tender, opportunistic, transactional, or violent. It cannot tell us how the people involved understood one another. The temptation to romanticize the contact should therefore be resisted. Yet it should also be resisted in the other direction. Nothing in the genetic record demands that Neanderthal and Homo sapiens relations were defined only by hostility. Some degree of social proximity, however brief or uneven, clearly occurred. That alone expands the emotional and moral landscape of the story. These were not merely enemies across a species line. They were humans meeting humans in ways that sometimes crossed into family. One lesser-known consequence of this genetic evidence is how it has altered the concept of human uniqueness itself. For generations, modern humans were treated as a singular surviving species emerging cleanly from all others. Now the picture looks more like a thinning forest in which one branch remains standing but carries grafts from neighbouring trees. We are the last surviving human species. Yes, but not biologically untouched by the others. The genome preserves contact zones that the archaeological record only hints at. In this sense, every person carrying Neanderthal ancestry becomes a quiet archive of encounter, not a clear portrait, not a living cultural continuity, but a molecular echo of ancient meetings on cold landscapes where no one knew they were participating in a future human mixture. There is also a melancholy asymmetry here. Genetics can prove that part of Neanderthals survives in us, but it cannot restore the world that made them themselves. A few % of DNA does not recreate the broad chest built for Ice Age effort, the dense local knowledge of a specific valley, the inherited hunting rhythms, the particular gestures around a fire, the way a child learned from adults whose lives were organized around close-range force and cold endurance. Genes travel more easily than lifeways. What gets absorbed biologically may be detached from the social world that once gave it meaning. So when we say Neanderthals survive in us, that must be said with care. Their distinct humanity did not continue intact. What continued were fragments. Even fragments, though, carry philosophical weight. They undermine the easy idea that evolution always sorts cleanly by superiority. If Neanderthal populations simply lost because they were worse at being human, why did some of their genes remain useful enough to keep? Why did contact produce fertile descendants at all? The answer is that the disappearance of Neanderthals was not a judgment on their humanity. It was the outcome of changing ecological and demographic systems in which distinct populations met, competed, merged, and thinned unevenly. Strength became costly, social scale mattered, climate destabilized. But none of that turned Neanderthals into evolutionary dead ends in the crude sense. They contributed materially to the future, even as their separate path closed. This makes the ending of their story harder to simplify and harder to forget. Somewhere in the long overlap between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, children were born whose bodies already represented a crossing of worlds. They carried lineages shaped by different climates, different histories, different balances of strength and flexibility. Most of the details are lost. We do not know the names, the voices, the terms of kinship, or whether these children belonged fully anywhere in the social maps around them. But they existed. Their descendants existed, and through them, the divide between the ancient strong humans and the later dominant humans becomes less like a wall and more like a dissolving edge. Imagine one of those border landscapes where a Neanderthal group and a Homo sapiens group move through the same river corridor in different seasons, perhaps sometimes seeing signs of one another, perhaps sometimes meeting face to face. The tools differ a little. The bodies differ more. The habits of movement and social scale differ in ways no one present could name scientifically. Yet the firelight looks the same. Hunger feels the same. A child's cry sounds the same in the cold. Then, at some point, distance closes. Not only in conflict or avoidance, but in touch. From that point on, the story is no longer one of pure succession. It becomes a story of blending within disappearance. So the legacy of the ancient humans who seem to choose strength over intelligence does not end with their last independent camp. It continues, faint but real, inside later humanity. Their bodies as a distinct form vanish. Their world of dense local mastery narrows and goes dark, but their inheritance moves forward in pieces, folded into the more flexible species that outlasts them. The irony is almost perfect. They are remembered by a future that often misunderstood them, and carried biologically by descendants who long imagined themselves wholly separate. In the end, the strongest humans did not remain as themselves, yet neither did they leave entirely. Some part of them crossed the threshold with us. What makes this story matter beyond prehistory is not only that a human population disappeared, but that the logic behind its disappearance is still recognizable. Evolution does not reward goodness, courage, or even intelligence in any simple moral sense. It rewards fit. And fit is always temporary because the world never stops changing. A trait can be magnificent under one set of conditions and ruinous under another. A body can be a masterpiece and a burden at the same time. A strategy can work for hundreds of thousands of years and still fail when the environment, the competitors, and the scale of uncertainty all shift together. This is the deeper lesson carried by the ancient humans who seem, from a distance, to have chosen strength over intelligence. Their real story is not about a poor choice. It is about the fragility of advantages that become too narrowly tied to a world already beginning to vanish. That lesson begins with the body, because the body is where adaptation becomes costly enough to feel. Neanderthal strength is not decorative, it is architecture. Broad trunks, shortened limbs, dense muscle, powerful hands, large joints, and repeated physical competence all form a coherent answer to Ice Age life. For a long time, the answer is correct. It solves immediate problems with extraordinary effectiveness. It helps secure prey, conserve heat, endure impact, and survive the kind of day-to-day hardship that modern people rarely imagine clearly. Yet because it is such a committed answer, it also narrows the range of futures in which that body remains cheap enough, efficient enough, and flexible enough to win. Once the world starts rewarding different combinations of speed, social scale, mobility, lower maintenance, and technological diversity, the powerful body loses some of its old certainty. The very completeness of its adaptation becomes the source of its exposure. This is not a uniquely Neanderthal problem. It is one of the oldest patterns in natural history. Specialists flourish until they're niche fragments. Generalists often look less impressive when conditions are stable, but they have more room to bend when those conditions shift. Yet the contrast must be handled carefully, because the world does not divide cleanly between specialists and generalists. Homo sapiens are not limitless generalists, and Neanderthals are not mindless, narrow machines. Both are intelligent, both adaptable within real limits, and both carry trade-offs. The difference is that one package proves more durable under late Pleistocene instability. That durability lies not in one magical trait, but in a broader margin for error. Lower per-body costs, wider social ties, more flexible symbolic systems, more varied tools, and greater ability to distribute risk across distance all allow Homo sapiens to survive situations that might become catastrophic for a more expensive, more local strategy. The lesson is therefore not that flexibility is always better than strength. It is that flexibility becomes priceless when conditions stop repeating. There is something deeply human in our resistance to that lesson. We prefer to believe that survival belongs to the best, by which we usually mean the most admirable according to present values. If the ancient strong humans vanished, then perhaps we tell ourselves they must have lacked the one thing that ultimately mattered. Perhaps they were less inventive, less social, less worthy of continuation. But what survives in the record suggests something more uncomfortable. A population can be brave, intelligent, cooperative, technically capable, and superbly suited to its world, and still lose its separate future. What destroys it need not be inferiority. It may be a mismatch between deep adaptation and a rapidly shifting environment. There is no moral fairness in that. There is only contingency. This is one reason the story feels unexpectedly modern. Human societies continue to build forms of life around conditions they assume will last. Economies grow dependent on stable climates, reliable trade routes, abundant energy, narrow technologies, or political systems that seem permanent until suddenly they are not. Institutions become strong by becoming specialized. People become skilled within those institutions. Entire ways of living can seem durable precisely because they have worked for so long. Then conditions change. Not enough at first to force immediate abandonment, only enough to make old strengths gradually more expensive, more brittle, less sufficient. Scholars still debate how directly ancient cases can be compared to modern ones, and the evidence remains incomplete whenever such analogies grow too neat. but the structural echo is hard to miss. History repeatedly shows that what makes a system powerful can also make it fragile when the background shifts. One lesser known but important dimension of this lesson concerns time lag. Advantages rarely announce the moment they begin to fail. A society, species, or lineage may continue appearing successful long after the deeper conditions of success have eroded. That is what makes decline so difficult to read from inside. Neanderthals do not wake one morning to discover that their bodies are obsolete. Their hunts still sometimes succeed. Their fires still burn. Their children are still born. Their elders still teach. A few good seasons can mask the larger trend. In the same way, modern systems often keep functioning visibly, even as the assumptions beneath them degrade. The most dangerous phase is not open collapse, but delayed recognition. By the time a specialist realizes the world is asking a different question, much of the margin for adjusting may already be gone. Demography sharpens this lesson further. Small populations make fragile archives. They lose knowledge faster, recover more slowly, and cannot absorb repeated stress without cumulative damage. This is true whether the population in question is an Ice Age foraging band or a highly specialized modern institution. The issue is not merely how good the system is at peak performance, but how well it can survive interruption, error, and attrition. A large network can fail locally and still continue. A small one may vanish with the loss of a few key members. What survives in the record suggests that Neanderthals were not lacking intelligence. They were often lacking scale. Their knowledge may have been profound, but its pathways of preservation were narrower. That is another lesson. With wide historical reach, wisdom without redundancy is more vulnerable than people think. There is also a caution here about how we measure intelligence itself. Modern cultures often admire forms of intelligence that externalize well writing, visible art, complex trade, formal abstraction, durable institutions. Those are real achievements. But other forms of intelligence are quieter. They live in timing, physical judgment, sensory awareness, ecological memory, and the capacity to coordinate action under risk. Neanderthals remind us that a species or society can be extraordinarily intelligent in embodied and local ways, while still being overtaken by rivals better suited to scaling information across larger systems. The lesson is not that one kind of intelligence is false. It is that intelligence has domains, and domains change in value when environments change. A mind matched too closely to one scale of problem may suffer when the world begins operating at another. This is perhaps the most unsettling part of the story. We often imagine adaptation as moving upward, toward more complexity and therefore more security. But complexity can itself become specialization. Large networks can fail. Broad systems can become brittle. The future does not belong automatically to the most advanced, any more than the Pleistocene belonged forever to the strongest. What belongs to the future, when anything does, is whatever can still absorb change after old advantages start turning into costs. That may sometimes be the lighter body, the broader alliance, the less elegant but more flexible tool. At other times it may be a return to local knowledge, simplification, or resilience built through redundancy rather than performance. The Neanderthal lesson does not offer one ideology of success. It offers a warning against mistaking present fit for permanent fit. Imagine again the ancient strong humans at the height of their competence. They have every reason to trust what their ancestors have given them. The body works, the hunt works, the shelter choices work, the seasonal knowledge works. Their world has always been hard, but hard in ways they know how to answer. Then, over generations, the answers begin arriving a little late, costing a little more, requiring a little more luck. Another human strategy appears in the same spaces. The land still looks familiar enough to trust, even as its deeper rhythms shift. That is how advantages become fragile, not through dramatic reversal, but through the slow withdrawal of the conditions that made them right. And so the lesson widens beyond Neanderthals themselves. Their story becomes a study in the danger of confusing excellence with permanence. The most impressive adaptation in one era may be the least forgiving in the next. The strongest body may be too expensive. The most efficient institution may be too rigid. The most perfected tradition may be hardest to revise. No single explanation fully accounts for why one path continues and another narrows into extinction or absorption. But one pattern remains visible from Ice Age Eurasia to the present. Systems endure not only by being good at their work, but by retaining some capacity to be remade when the work itself changes. That is why the ancient humans who seem to choose strength over intelligence continue to trouble us. They reveal how easily we misread survival. We see the victor and assume inevitability. We see the vanished and assume deficiency. Yet the record suggests a world in which the vanished were, in many ways, magnificent. They simply belong too completely to a set of conditions that stopped holding. Their lesson is not that strength is foolish. It is that every advantage carries a hidden question. Advantage for what world? For how long? And what happens when that world no longer agrees? In the end, the disappearance of the ancient strong humans is not marked by a single dramatic silence. It is marked by thinning, a favoured shelter used less often, a hunting corridor crossed by fewer familiar bodies, a style of tool that appears in one layer and then not in the next, a lineage that once stretched across enormous reaches of Eurasia, becoming narrower, more local, more fragile, until at last it no longer persists as a separate human form. The last Neanderthals, if we can call them that without oversimplifying a long regional process, do not stand at the edge of history knowing they are last. They live as all humans live, inside the immediate demands of weather, hunger, injury, companionship, memory, and hope. That is what makes their ending so difficult to imagine clearly. It is not an ending experienced as theory. It is an ending experienced as ordinary life growing steadily harder to renew. Somewhere in Western Eurasia, perhaps in the Iberian Peninsula, perhaps in pockets of southern France, perhaps in other refugial zones whose exact chronologies scholars still debate, small groups persist after many of their kind have already disappeared elsewhere. The evidence remains incomplete, and some dates once thought late have been challenged, revised, or rejected. That uncertainty matters. It reminds us that the last phase of Neanderthal existence is not a cinematic last stand illuminated by certainty, but a patchwork of local survivals, disappearances, and possible mixtures with incoming Homo sapiens. Yet the broader emotional pattern remains persuasive. These are not the central populations of a thriving world anymore. They are the remnants of one, living in territories that still allow their way of life to function, though often under increasingly narrow conditions. The last strong humans are still strong. That is essential to remember. Their bodies have not somehow become lesser versions of themselves. Their hands still grip with force. Their chests still carry cold air through winters that would punish weaker frames. Their legs still know rough ground. Their hunting knowledge is still real, their experience still deep, their social dependence still human. If one were to meet them without knowledge of what comes after, there might be nothing obviously doomed about them at all. They would look as they always had, compact, capable, disciplined by the ordinary effort of survival. The tragedy is not written plainly on the body. It lies in the shrinking world around the body, the contracting network, the worsening arithmetic of continuity. By this stage, every demographic loss matters more than before. One skilled adult gone means fewer safe hunts, less knowledge transmitted, fewer hands for processing, fewer possible pairings in populations already spread thin. A child lost is not just grief, but one less future adult in a system that needs every future adult badly. An injury that once would have been absorbed by a larger or more connected population becomes harder to carry. A season of poor returns has longer after effects. This is how endings often happen in human history, not with spectacular defeat, but with the progressive loss of redundancy. The strong ancient humans may still master the tasks immediately before them, but the capacity to replace themselves through time is weakening. Contact with Homo sapiens in these final phases may take many forms. In some places it may mean avoidance, with groups moving through the same broader landscapes at different times. In others it may mean pressure on key resources, reduced access to the best shelters or migration bottlenecks, or gradual displacement into less favourable ecological pockets. In still other cases it may mean interbreeding, the blurring of boundaries through reproduction rather than open contest. Scholars still debate how these processes combined in different regions, and no single explanation fully accounts for every last occupation. But by now, whether through competition, mixture, or ecological compression, the distinct Neanderthal world is no longer reproducing itself on continental terms. It survives only locally, temporarily, and under strain. There is something deeply moving in the possibility that the last generations may not have understood themselves as living through a historical ending at all. Human beings are poor at recognizing finality from inside. We trust routines because routines have carried us before. We believe in next season because most seasons are followed by another. The old shelter worked. The old pass held prey. The fire can still be made. The elders still remember. Even if the neighbouring valley now belongs to strangers, even if the winters feel less reliable, even if the children are fewer, life goes on as life always does, by immediate acts of maintenance. This may be why extinction is so hard to imagine morally. The last members of a lineage are rarely dramatic symbols. They are people still trying to make evening come safely after afternoon. One lesser known but haunting thought is that the final disappearance of Neanderthals may not have felt like disappearance at all, if interbreeding played a significant role in some regions. If a dwindling population merges into incoming Homo sapiens groups, then the last children carrying largely Neanderthal ancestry may also be among the first children of a blended future. In that sense, the ending would be both loss and transformation, a distinct body form, a distinct demographic path. A distinct balance of local mastery and physical specialization would cease, but not every person at the boundary would vanish into emptiness. Some would cross over biologically into another human stream. The record cannot tell us how they felt about that, whether they understood it, resisted it, or simply lived it as family. Yet the possibility deepens the sadness of the ending. A people can disappear not only by dying, but by becoming indistinguishable from those who remain. The last camps would still have looked human in all the essential ways. Firelight against stone, meat divided by practiced hands, a child watching adults work, someone tending a wound, someone checking weather in the wind, someone recalling where prey once came in greater numbers, perhaps someone noticing that signs of other humans are more common now, ash in the wrong shelter, footprints of strangers, a style of cut mark or stone flake not quite their own. The world would not announce the extinction of a lineage, It would announce only pressure, difference, uncertainty, and the need to continue. That ordinariness may be the hardest thing to absorb. The disappearance of Neanderthals was not a mythic event lived as myth. It was lived as diminishing continuity. And yet, despite everything, the last strong humans remain what they had always been, not brutes, not failed versions of us, not cautionary cartoons about the triumph of brain over body. They remain a branch of humanity shaped to an extraordinary degree by force, cold, risk, and local ecological intelligence. Their great mistake, if such a word can even be used, is not stupidity. It is that their success belongs too deeply to a world in retreat. They are among the clearest examples in all human history of a lineage that becomes almost perfectly adapted to a difficult reality, only to find that reality itself dissolving under new climatic patterns and new human competition. Their strength does not betray them. Time does. This is why their end lingers in the imagination long after the factual details are exhausted. The last Neanderthals force us to confront a version of disappearance that is not deserved and not simple. They do everything a successful people should do. They endure, they teach, they hunt, they care for the injured, they know their terrain, they keep children alive through harsh seasons, they make tools, maintain fire, and continue the hard labor of being human. But the wider structure needed to carry that humanity forward as a separate form is failing. The land is less predictable, the populations are too thin, the networks are too narrow, the competitors are too numerous or too flexible. Piece by piece, the conditions that once justified the powerful body and the local expert mind are withdrawn. Imagine one evening among the last of them. The air is cold, though not always in the old familiar way. The fire burns low and steady. The adults say little because work is enough speech for the moment. A child, perhaps one of the last who will grow mainly into this ancient body plan, watches the movement of hands over food and tools, learning patterns that had once held for countless generations. Outside, the dark landscape carries fewer guarantees than it once did. Herds move differently. Other humans are nearer. The old strengths remain beautiful, but beauty is no defense against a future built for another balance of traits. Morning will come. The group will rise and continue. That is what humans do. And then, somewhere beyond the reach of names, one season will pass into another, one small group into another, until the distinct people who had embodied strength so completely are no longer there to pass their way of life on by themselves. The last strong humans will have become memory, mixture, and bone. As the long story settles, what remains is not the victory of intelligence over strength, but the fragility of every human adaptation before time. The ancient strong humans lived close to stone, weather, prey, and one another. Their world was narrow in some ways, but it was also exact. It asked much of the body and much of memory, and for an immense span of time they answered it successfully. They carried heat through cold country in broad chests. They carried food across rough ground in powerful arms. They carried knowledge in habit, attention, and the slow teaching of children who learned the land by moving through it. Nothing about that was lesser. It was simply costly, local, and tied to conditions that would not last. In the end, the sadness of their story lies in how recognizable it is. They did not vanish because they stopped being human. They vanished because the world changed its terms, and another human strategy proved better able to survive the change. Yet even that is not the whole truth, because part of them crossed forward. Some of their inheritance remains in later people. faint but real, like warmth lingering in stone after a fire has gone out. Their separate bodies disappeared. Their distinct camps fell silent. Their paths across the cold plains were covered by weather, grass, and time. But their story did not end in nothing. And perhaps that is the final image to keep. Not a battlefield, not a contest won by the clever over the strong, but a dim plain under evening light, the tracks of several kinds of humans crossing the same ground, some ending, some continuing, some blending. Wind passes over them all. The fire burns for a while, then cools. Bones settle into the earth. The landscape changes again, and still, beneath everything that came later, there remains the memory of a human form built to endure the world directly, with all the dignity and danger that required. Their strength did not save them forever. No strength ever does. But for a long time it carried them through the cold and through the dark, and far enough that some part of them is still here. End of script.